74,000 years ago, the sky caught fire. Not metaphorically, actually caught fire. The air itself burned, and when it was over, when the ash finally settled and the screaming stopped, there were maybe 10,000 humans left on the entire planet. 10,000. That's not a city. That's barely a town. Every person alive today, all 8 billion of us, we're all descended from that tiny group of survivors. From people who made it through what might be the worst day in human history. And here's what keeps me awake at night. We almost didn't make it. We came so close to extinction that you can see it in our DNA. You can measure it. You can count the moment when humanity nearly blinked out of existence. The moment is called the Toba Catastrophe. And if you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. But fair warning, this story goes deep. It goes to the edge of everything humans have ever known, to the moment we almost vanished forever. So maybe get comfortable, because we're about to talk about the day the world ended and somehow, against every odd, started again. The volcano that nearly killed us all sits in Indonesia, or what's left of it does. It's called Toba, and today it's a lake, the largest volcanic lake on Earth. About 60 miles long, nearly 20 miles wide, and in some places over 1,500 feet deep. The water is calm, the shores are peaceful. People fish there, they build houses, they live normal lives. But underneath all that water, underneath all that calm, there's a scar. A wound in the earth so massive that even after 74,000 years, it hasn't healed. Because Toba isn't just a volcano. It's a supervolcano. And there's a difference. A regular volcano erupts. It spews lava, throws up some ash, maybe destroys a town or two. It's local. It's contained. A supervolcano doesn't just erupt. It explodes. It detonates with the force of 1 million atomic bombs. It doesn't destroy a town. It rewrites continents. It changes the climate. It blocks out the sun. When Toba went off 74,000 years ago, it ejected more than 670 cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere. 670 cubic miles. That's not a number you can picture. It's not a number that makes sense to the human brain. Try this instead. Imagine every single building in your city, every house, every skyscraper, every parking garage, all of it, ground to dust and thrown into the sky. Now multiply that by 1,000, you're still not close. The explosion was so big, so violent, that it left a hole in the ground 30 miles long and 20 miles wide. That hole is now the lake, the caldera. What's left after a mountain explodes from the inside out and collapses into itself. But the hole in the ground isn't the scary part. The scary part is what went up. When Toba exploded, it sent a column of ash and gas 60 miles into the sky. 60 miles. That's twice the height of the stratosphere. That's where the sky stops being sky and starts being space. The ash spread across the entire planet. Scientists have found Toba ash in ice cores from Greenland, in sediment layers in the Indian Ocean, in soil samples from East Africa. The ash traveled 10,000 miles in some directions, carried by winds that wrapped around the globe like a shroud. And it didn't just fall for a few days. It fell for weeks, maybe months. Imagine living through that. You wake up one morning and the sky is darker than it should be. There's a sound in the distance like thunder, but it doesn't stop. It gets louder. The ground starts to shake. Not a quick jolt, but a long, rolling tremor that makes you sick to your stomach. You look to the horizon and you see it. A wall of darkness rising into the sky, bigger than anything you've ever seen. Bigger than anything you thought possible. The wall spreads. It moves toward you faster than you can run. And then the sky goes black. Not night black, ash black. The kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face. The air fills with particles so thick you can barely breathe. Every breath burns, your eyes water, your throat closes up. The ash falls like snow, but it's hot. It piles up on the ground, inches deep, then feet deep. It covers everything, your shelter, your food, your water, and it keeps falling, day after day after day. The temperature drops, not slowly, fast. Within months, maybe weeks, the entire planet cools by 20 degrees Fahrenheit. In some places, more. Summer turns to winter overnight. Crops that were growing yesterday are dead today, frozen under a blanket of ash and ice. Animals that survived the initial blast start dying from starvation. Then the predators die. Then the scavengers. The whole ecosystem collapses level by level like a building falling in on itself. Here's what the science tells us. After Toba erupted, the Earth entered what's called a volcanic winter. The ash in the atmosphere blocked out the sun. Not completely, but enough. Enough that plants couldn't photosynthesize properly. Enough that temperatures plummeted. Enough that ice sheets that had been slowly melting suddenly started growing again. This wasn't a local event. This was global. In Africa, where most humans lived at the time, the forests died back. The grasslands turned to desert. Lakes dried up. Rivers stopped flowing. The few humans who survived the initial blast found themselves in a world that was actively trying to kill them. And they weren't ready. 74,000 years ago, humans weren't what we are now. We were smart, sure. We had fire, we had tools. We had language, probably. But we were few, scattered, fragile. There might have been a few 100,000 of us total, spread across Africa, and maybe a few small groups that had started to migrate out. We lived in small bands, maybe 20 to 50 people per group, hunting, gathering, trying to survive day by day. We didn't have cities. We didn't have agriculture. We didn't have writing or metal, or any of the things we think of as civilization. We were just people trying to make it in a world that was already dangerous. And then the sky fell. The genetic evidence is terrifying. When scientists study human DNA, they can look backward in time. They can see when populations grew, when they shrank, when they mixed with other groups. And when they look at the human genome, they see something strange. A bottleneck. A moment around 70 to 75,000 years ago when the human population crashed. Hard. Some estimates put the total number of breeding adults at around 10,000. Some say it might have been as low as 2,000. 2,000 people. Total. On the entire planet. To put that in perspective, that's fewer people than currently live in a small town. That's a high school gymnasium full of people, and that's it. That's all of humanity. Everyone alive today, every culture, every language, every family line, all of it traces back to that tiny group of survivors. The bottleneck lasted for thousands of years. This wasn't a quick disaster that we bounced back from. This was a long, grinding, near-extinction event. For generation after generation, humans lived on the edge. We hunted whatever we could find. We ate whatever was left. We moved when we had to, looking for places where the ash wasn't as thick, where some plants still grew, where some animals still lived. We huddled in caves when we could find them. We burned whatever fuel we could scavenge. We told stories to keep ourselves sane, to remember who we were, to teach our children how to survive. And slowly, over thousands of years, we climbed back. The ash settled, the sun came back, the temperatures warmed, plants started growing again, animals returned. And the few thousand humans who'd made it through, who'd survived the worst catastrophe our species has ever faced, they started to spread out again. They had children. Those children had children. The population grew. We left Africa. We spread across Asia, into Europe, to Australia, eventually to the Americas. We built civilizations. We invented agriculture, writing, cities, nations. We forgot about Toba. For 74,000 years, we forgot. Until we found the evidence buried in the ice and the rock and our own DNA. The proof that once, not that long ago in geological terms, we almost ended. Let's talk about what actually happens when a supervolcano erupts, because the scale is hard to grasp without walking through it step by step. Toba didn't just blow up. It built up to the explosion over thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. Deep underground, magma collected in a chamber. Not a small chamber. A massive reservoir of molten rock, miles across, filled with gas and pressure. The chamber sat there, growing, waiting. Above it, the ground swelled like a blister. The earth itself rose up, pushed by the pressure below. Small earthquakes became common. Hot springs appeared. Gases vented from cracks in the ground. These are the warning signs, the things that tell you something big is coming. But 74,000 years ago, there was no one who could read those signs. No scientists, no monitoring equipment, no way to know what was building beneath the surface. And then one day, the chamber couldn't hold it anymore. The rock above it cracked. The pressure was released all at once, and the entire top of the mountain exploded outward and upward with a force that's almost impossible to comprehend. The explosion was so loud it would have been heard thousands of miles away. The shockwave traveled across continents. In the first seconds, rock and magma were thrown into the sky at supersonic speeds. The column of ash and gas climbed higher and higher, punching through the atmosphere, reaching into the stratosphere, spreading out like an umbrella that covered half the planet. Pyroclastic flows raced down the sides of the mountain. These aren't like lava flows. Lava is slow. You can walk away from lava. Pyroclastic flows are superheated clouds of gas and rock fragments that move at hundreds of miles per hour, faster than any human or animal could run. They incinerate everything they touch. Trees, buildings, people, all of it turned to ash in seconds. The flows from Toba traveled for miles, filling valleys, burying entire landscapes under hundreds of feet of hot ash and rock. Everything within 1,000 miles of the volcano was destroyed instantly. Forests burned, lakes boiled away. The ground itself was sterilized, turned into a grey wasteland where nothing could grow for years. But that was just the beginning. The real damage came from the ash that went up. When volcanic ash reaches the stratosphere, it doesn't fall back down quickly. It stays up there, circulating in the upper atmosphere, carried by winds around the entire planet. The ash particles reflect sunlight back into space. They act like a mirror or a shield, blocking the sun's heat from reaching the surface. In the months after Toba erupted, the Earth's temperature dropped fast. The volcanic winter had begun. In the tropics, where it's always warm, temperatures fell below freezing. Snow fell in places that had never seen snow. In the temperate zones, summer never came. Crops failed, not just in one region, but everywhere. The ash blocked so much sunlight that plants couldn't grow. Without plants, the herbivores starved. Without herbivores, the carnivores starved. The entire food chain collapsed. For humans, this was catastrophic. We were hunter-gatherers. We depended on wild plants and animals for food. When those disappeared, we had nothing. No stored grain, no domesticated animals, no backup plan. We were living hand to mouth, and suddenly there was nothing to put in our mouths. Some groups might have lasted a few weeks on whatever they'd managed to store. Others probably died within days. The lucky ones, if you can call them lucky, found places where the effects weren't quite as severe. Maybe a valley that caught less ash. Maybe a coastal area where they could eat shellfish and seaweed. maybe a cave system that stayed warm enough to survive in. These are the people who made it through. These are our ancestors, and they went through hell. Imagine being one of those survivors. You've watched most of your family die. Starvation, cold, disease. You're weak, hungry, scared. The world you knew is gone. The animals you used to hunt are gone. The plants you used to gather are gone. Every day is a fight to find food, to stay warm, to stay alive. You don't know if the sun will ever come back. You don't know if this darkness will last forever. You don't even know if there are other humans left, or if you're the last ones. You probably saw other groups, refugees like you, wandering, desperate. Maybe you helped each other. Maybe you fought over what little food was left. Maybe you did things you never thought you'd do, things you'd be ashamed of if there was anyone left to judge you. But you survived. You found a way. You taught your children to survive. You kept going. The genetic evidence shows us something else too. The bottleneck wasn't uniform. Some populations were hit harder than others. The groups that were living near Toba in Southeast Asia were probably wiped out entirely. The blast would have killed them instantly, or the ash would have buried them. The groups in Africa, farther from the volcano, had a better chance. But even they were devastated. The population crashed across the board. What's interesting is what happened next. After the bottleneck, after the population recovered, humans weren't quite the same. We'd been through a filter, a brutal test of survival. The people who made it through were the ones who could adapt, who could innovate, who could work together. Some scientists think this is when humans really became modern. Not physically, we'd looked like this for a while, but behaviorally. The Toba catastrophe might have forced us to get smarter, more creative, more cooperative. It might have been the crucible that forged modern humanity. There's evidence for this in the archaeological record. Around 70,000 years ago, right after Toba, we start seeing new kinds of tools. More sophisticated blades, spear points, fishing hooks. We start seeing art, beads, carvings, ochre paintings. We start seeing evidence of long-distance trade, of symbolic thinking, of complex culture. It's like something switched on in the human brain. Or maybe it didn't switch on. Maybe it was forced on. Maybe the only way to survive Toba was to think differently, to plan further ahead, to cooperate more closely, to pass on knowledge more effectively. Maybe the people who couldn't do those things died, and the ones who could lived and passed those traits on to their children. Natural selection in its rawest, most brutal form. The volcanic winter lasted for years, maybe a decade. The exact timeline is hard to pin down because we're looking at events that happened so long ago. But the ice cores, the sediment layers, they all tell the same story. Long period of cold, long period of darkness, long period of death. And then slowly, things started to improve. The ash settled out of the atmosphere. Some fell as rain, acidic rain that poisoned lakes and rivers but at least cleared the air. Some settled on the ground in layers that are still visible today, if you know where to look. The sun came back, weak at first, then stronger. The temperature started to rise. Life began to return. The first plants to come back were probably the hardy ones. Grasses, mosses, ferns. Things that could grow in poor soil, that could survive in cold. They spread across the ash-covered landscape, green pioneers reclaiming a grey world. Then came the animals. Insects first, then small mammals, then larger ones. The ecosystem rebuilt itself slowly, species by species, link by link. And humans were part of that rebuilding. We followed the animals. We followed the plants. We moved into new territories looking for places to live, places to hunt, places to thrive. This is probably when the great human migration really began. Before Toba, most humans lived in Africa. After Toba, we spread everywhere. Maybe the disaster pushed us out, forced us to leave our ancestral homelands and look for better places. Maybe it taught us that we could survive anywhere, that we could adapt to any environment. Maybe it gave us the confidence or the desperation to explore. Within a few thousand years of Toba, humans had reached Australia. We'd spread across Asia. We were on the verge of entering Europe. We were becoming a global species. All of us carrying the genetic scars of that near extinction. All of us descended from the few thousand who'd made it through the darkness. Now let's talk about what we know and what we don't know, because the Toba catastrophe theory isn't without controversy. The basic facts aren't in dispute. Toba erupted about 74,000 years ago. It was a massive eruption, one of the largest in the last few million years. It ejected enormous amounts of ash and gas into the atmosphere. That's all confirmed by the geological record. The ash layers are there, the caldera is there, the dating is solid. What's less certain is exactly how bad the effects were and whether they really caused a human population bottleneck. The genetic evidence for a bottleneck is strong, but genetics can be tricky to interpret. The bottleneck could have been caused by Toba, or it could have been caused by something else around the same time. Or it could have been a combination of factors, with Toba being the final blow that pushed an already struggling population to the brink. Some scientists argue that the volcanic winter wasn't as severe as originally thought. They point to evidence that suggests some regions were less affected than others. That life didn't completely stop, it just got harder. They say humans might have been more resilient than we give them credit for, that we've always been good at adapting, at finding ways to survive in difficult conditions. There's evidence for this too. Archaeological sites from around the time of Toba show signs of continued human occupation. People were still making tools. They were still hunting. They were still living, even if they were struggling. So maybe the catastrophe theory is overblown. Maybe Toba was bad, but not extinction-level bad. Maybe we're projecting our modern fears onto ancient events, seeing our own potential doom in the geological record. But here's the thing. Even if the Toba catastrophe wasn't quite as bad as the worst-case scenario suggests, it was still catastrophic. Even if the volcanic winter only lasted a few years instead of a decade. Even if the temperature only dropped by 10 degrees instead of 20. Even if the human population bottleneck was caused by multiple factors instead of just Toba. It still happened. We still came close. We still nearly went extinct. And that matters because it tells us something important about our species and about the world we live in. It tells us that we're fragile, that despite all our intelligence, all our tools, all our culture, we can be brought to the edge of extinction by a single event. A volcano we didn't predict, a climate shift we couldn't control, a disaster we had no way to prepare for. It also tells us that we're resilient, that even when everything goes wrong, even when the world itself seems to be ending, some of us find a way through. We adapt, we survive, we rebuild. The question is, could it happen again? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. Toba is still there. The magma chamber is still there, deep underground, slowly refilling. It will erupt again someday, maybe not in our lifetimes, maybe not for another 100,000 years. But eventually, the pressure will build up again, and the mountain will explode. And Toba isn't the only supervolcano. There's Yellowstone in the United States, Campi Flegrei in Italy, Lake Taupo in New Zealand, all of them sitting on massive magma chambers, all of them capable of erupting with devastating force. We monitor them now. We have seismometers, gas sensors, satellite imagery. We can see the warning signs. We can track the earthquakes, the ground deformation, The changes in gas emissions. We're better prepared than humans were 74,000 years ago. We have technology, infrastructure, global communication networks. We have the ability to evacuate millions of people, to stockpile food and supplies, to coordinate a response. But would it be enough? If Yellowstone erupted tomorrow with the same force as Toba, it would devastate North America. The western United States would be buried under ash. The climate would change. Crops would fail. Supply chains would collapse. And that's with all our modern technology. We'd survive as a species, probably. We have too many of us now, spread across too many places. We have seed banks and food reserves and underground bunkers. But civilization might not survive. Not in its current form. The complex global systems we depend on, the just-in-time supply chains, the interconnected economies, all of it could come crashing down. And that's assuming we respond rationally, that we cooperate, that we don't descend into panic and violence. History suggests that's a big assumption. When things get bad, people get desperate. They fight over resources, they blame each other, they do terrible things. The humans who survived Toba probably saw all of this. They probably lived through it. And somehow, they held on to enough of their humanity to rebuild. Let's get into the details of what the world looked like right after Toba erupted. Because the more you understand the specifics, the more terrifying it becomes. The ash layer from Toba can still be found in core samples taken from the Indian Ocean. It's a distinct layer, several inches thick in some places, made up of tiny glass particles that could only have come from Toba. The layer is dated to 74,000 years ago. Above it, there are signs of a sudden change in the marine ecosystem. Species that prefer warm water disappear. Species that prefer cold water become dominant. The ocean itself changed. In Africa, there are similar signs in the sediment layers. The pollen record shows a sudden shift from forest to grassland. The types of plants that grow in cold, dry conditions become dominant. Animals that need forests start to disappear from the fossil record. The ice cores from Greenland show a spike in sulfate levels right around the time of Toba. Sulfate is what you get when volcanic gases reach the stratosphere and react with water vapor. It's one of the main components that causes volcanic winter. The spike in the Greenland ice is huge, bigger than almost anything else in the entire ice core record. It's a clear signature of a massive volcanic event. And it coincides exactly with the ash layers found in other parts of the world. The evidence all points to the same conclusion. Toba erupted. It was massive, and it changed the global climate. But what did that actually mean for the people living through it? Let's imagine you're a human living in East Africa 74,000 years ago. You're part of a small band, maybe 30 people total. You live along a river valley where there are trees for shelter, animals to hunt, and edible plants to gather. Life is hard, but manageable. You know the land, you know the seasons, you know where to find food. Then one day, the sky starts to change. It gets darker. The sunsets turn strange colors, deep reds and purples like nothing you've ever seen. At night, the stars disappear behind a haze. The elders in your group are worried. They've never seen anything like this before. The stories passed down from their grandparents don't mention skies like this. Within a few weeks, the temperature starts to drop. The nights get colder, the days are dimmer. Plants that should be flowering aren't. Animals are acting strange, moving to different areas, behaving unpredictably. Your group starts to worry about food. The easy hunting grounds aren't producing like they used to. The plants you normally gather are dying back. You start ranging farther from your camp, taking more risks, going into territories you normally avoid. Then the ash starts to fall. At first, it's just a fine dust in the air. You can taste it. It makes your eyes water. But within days it's falling thick, like snow, covering everything. The ash kills the plants it lands on. It contaminates the water. It gets into your food, your shelter, your lungs. People start getting sick. The very young and the very old are hit hardest. They develop coughs that won't go away. They get weaker. Some of them die. You try to help them, but you don't know how. You don't understand what's happening. You move your camp, trying to find a place where the ash isn't as thick. But it's everywhere. No matter where you go, it follows. The animals are dying too. You find their bodies scattered across the landscape, covered in ash, starved or suffocated. The hunting becomes desperate. Your group is competing with other bands for the few animals that are left. Sometimes you meet peacefully and share what little you have. Sometimes there are fights. People are killed over a single antelope carcass, over a patch of edible roots, over access to a spring that hasn't been completely contaminated. This goes on for months, then years. The cold doesn't let up. The ash keeps falling, though less heavily as time goes on. The plants don't come back. The animals don't come back. Your group gets smaller. Some die from hunger, some from disease, some from violence. Some just wander off and never return. By the time things start to improve, your band of 30 is down to maybe 8 or 10 people. You've lost friends, family, children. You've seen things you never wanted to see. You've done things you never thought you'd have to do. But you survived. You're one of the ones who made it. You're going to pass your genes on to the next generation. You're going to tell your children stories about the time the sky went dark, about the years of cold and hunger, about the people who didn't make it. Those stories will be passed down. They'll change over time, becoming myths, legends, half-remembered warnings. But the core truth will remain. The world can change. It can turn against you. And when it does, you have to adapt or die. This is the reality of the Toba catastrophe. Not an abstract scientific theory, but a lived experience for the few thousand humans who went through it. Every one of us is descended from those survivors. We carry their genes, their resilience, maybe even some echo of their trauma. There's another aspect to consider. What happened to human culture during the bottleneck? We know from archaeology that modern human behavior really takes off after Toba. We see more art, more sophisticated tools, more evidence of symbolic thinking. But what was lost? Before Toba, there might have been cultural traditions, stories, technologies that were wiped out when populations crashed. Small bands scattered across Africa, each with their own knowledge, their own innovations, their own ways of doing things. When those bands died out, their knowledge died with them. We'll never know what was lost. Maybe there were better ways of making tools that were forgotten. Maybe there were medicines, stories, songs that disappeared. Maybe there were entire ways of being human that were extinguished in the volcanic winter and never came back. Or maybe the opposite happened. Maybe the crisis forced the surviving groups to pool their knowledge, to share their innovations, to combine their cultures in new ways. Maybe the bottleneck, as terrible as it was, actually accelerated human development by forcing cooperation and cultural exchange. We don't know. We can only speculate based on the evidence we have. What we do know is that the humans who emerged from the bottleneck were different. They were the ones who'd proven they could survive the worst. They were the ones who'd adapted, innovated, cooperated. They were the founders of all modern human populations. Let's talk about the timeline of recovery, because it helps put the scale of this disaster into perspective. The eruption itself happened in a matter of hours or days. The pyroclastic flows, the ash column, the immediate devastation, all of that was fast. But the effects lasted for years, maybe decades. The volcanic winter probably peaked in the first year or two after the eruption. That's when the ash was thickest in the atmosphere, when temperatures were at their lowest, when the die-off was most severe. After that, things would have started to improve slowly. The ash settled. More sunlight got through. Temperatures crept back up. But it would have taken years for ecosystems to recover. Plants had to recolonize landscapes that had been buried under ash. Animals had to rebuild their populations from whatever small groups had survived. Humans had to do the same. The genetic bottleneck suggests that human populations stayed low for thousands of years after Toba. We didn't just bounce back immediately. We stayed small, vulnerable on the edge for a long time. It took maybe 10,000 years for human populations to really start growing again, to expand out of Africa, to spread across the world. 10,000 years. That's 400 generations. 400 generations of humans living in the shadow of Toba, carrying the memory of the catastrophe, building slowly back towards something like stability. And during all that time, Toba sat there, a massive scar on the landscape, a reminder of what had happened. The survivors who lived near it must have seen the caldera, the hole in the ground where a mountain used to be. They must have told stories about it, about the day the earth opened up and tried to swallow the world. Those stories would have spread, changed, become legends. Maybe that's where some of our oldest myths about the end of the world come from. Floods, fires, darkness, the idea that the world has ended before and will end again. Maybe those stories have their roots in real events, in catastrophes like Toba that were so traumatic they were passed down for generations, for millennia, until the details were lost, but the fear remained. Today we can visit Lake Toba. It's a tourist destination. People swim in the water, they boat on the lake, they take pictures of the peaceful scenery. But if you know what you're looking at, you can see the signs, the steep walls of the caldera, the volcanic islands in the middle of the lake, new cones that have grown up since the main eruption, the hot springs that still bubble up, heated by the magma chamber that's still there, still active, still slowly building toward the next eruption. Scientists monitor Toba closely. They measure the earthquakes. They track the ground deformation. They sample the gases coming out of the hot springs. So far, there's no sign that a major eruption is imminent. The magma chamber is refilling, but slowly. It could take another 100,000 years to build up enough pressure for another supervolcanic eruption. Or it could be sooner. We don't really know. The thing about supervolcanoes is that we don't have a lot of data. They erupt so rarely that we've never actually witnessed one in recorded history. The last major supervolcanic eruption was Toba, 74,000 years ago. Before that, you have to go back hundreds of thousands of years to find another one. We're extrapolating from a very small sample size. We think we know what the warning signs would be, but we've never actually seen them in real time. If Toba started showing signs of an imminent eruption tomorrow, we'd evacuate the area. We'd prepare as best we could. But there's not much you can do against a supervolcano. You can't stop it. You can't divert it. You just get out of the way and hope for the best. And even if you're thousands of miles away from the volcano itself, you're still going to be affected. The ash will reach you eventually. The climate will change. Food will become scarce. The modern world, with all its complexity and interconnection, would face challenges that make the original Toba catastrophe look simple in comparison. Because here's the thing, we're more advanced than the humans of 74,000 years ago, but we're also more dependent. We depend on global supply chains for food, medicine, technology. We depend on stable climates for agriculture. We depend on functioning infrastructure for survival. When those systems break down, we don't have the skills our ancestors had. We don't know how to hunt and gather. We don't know how to make fire without matches. We don't know how to navigate without GPS. We've traded resilience for efficiency, and that makes us vulnerable in ways our ancestors weren't. The humans who survived Toba were tough. They knew how to survive in harsh conditions because they'd been doing it their whole lives. They could read the land, track animals, find water, build shelter with nothing but their hands and simple tools. We can't do any of that. Most of us would die within weeks if we were suddenly thrown into the kind of world that existed after Toba. But we do have advantages. We have knowledge. We have science. We can predict and prepare in ways our ancestors couldn't. We have the ability to work together on a global scale, to share resources, to coordinate responses. If we use those advantages wisely, we might be able to weather a future catastrophe better than our ancestors weathered Toba. Or we might not. It depends on whether we can overcome our divisions, our selfishness, our short-term thinking. It depends on whether we can learn from the past and prepare for a future that includes the possibility of disaster. The story of Toba is a reminder that the Earth doesn't care about us. It's not trying to kill us, but it's not trying to protect us either. It operates on its own timeline, following its own rules. Volcanoes will erupt, climates will change, asteroids will fall. These things have happened before and they will happen again. The question is whether we'll be ready, whether we'll have learned enough, prepared enough to survive the next catastrophe when it comes. Let's shift gears and talk about the evidence we've found that helps us understand what happened during Toba. Because this isn't just speculation. We have hard data. We have ash layers, ice cores, genetic studies all pointing to the same conclusion. The ash layers are the most direct evidence. When Toba erupted, it threw out so much ash that it circled the globe. That ash settled on land and sea, creating a distinct layer that can be found in sediment cores from all over the world. In the Indian Ocean, researchers have drilled cores that go down hundreds of feet into the seafloor. In those cores, they found a layer of ash several inches thick, dated to 74,000 years ago. The ash is distinctive. It has a specific chemical composition that matches the rock from Toba. It's like a fingerprint. You can tell exactly where it came from. The same ash layer shows up in cores from the South China Sea, from the Arabian Sea, from the Bay of Bengal. It even shows up on land, in Malaysia, in India, in East Africa. Everywhere you look around the Indian Ocean, you find this layer. It's a record of the eruption, frozen in time. The ice cores are even more interesting. In Greenland, scientists drill down through the ice sheet, pulling up cylinders of ice that contain trapped bubbles of ancient air and layers of snow that fell thousands of years ago. Each layer is like a page in a history book, recording the climate conditions at the time it formed. In the Greenland ice cores, there's a layer from 74,000 years ago that shows a massive spike in sulfate. Sulfate comes from volcanic gases. When a volcano erupts, it releases sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. That gas rises into the stratosphere, reacts with water vapor, and forms sulfuric acid aerosols. Those aerosols reflect sunlight, causing cooling. Eventually, they fall back to Earth as acid rain, leaving sulfate deposits in the ice. The spike from Toba is huge. It's one of the largest volcanic signals in the entire Greenland ice core record. It tells us that Toba's gases reached the stratosphere and spread globally. The ice cores also show a temperature drop right after the sulfate spike. The climate cooled suddenly and stayed cool for years. This is the signature of volcanic winter. The genetic evidence is more complex but just as compelling. When geneticists study human DNA, they can look at the variations between different people and populations. Those variations are like mutations that accumulate over time. By comparing the DNA of people from different parts of the world, scientists can build a family tree that shows how we're all related. That family tree reveals something interesting. All modern humans are remarkably similar genetically. More similar than we should be if our population had stayed large and stable for hundreds of thousands of years. We have less genetic diversity than many other species, even species that have much smaller current populations. Why? The most likely explanation is a population bottleneck. At some point in our recent evolutionary past, the human population crashed to very low numbers. When the population recovered, all the genetic diversity came from that small group of survivors. Everyone else, all the other lineages, were wiped out. The timing of that bottleneck based on genetic dating lines up with Toba. It's not perfect. Genetic dating has uncertainties, but it's close enough that most scientists think there's a connection. Toba caused or contributed to a population crash that brought humans to the brink of extinction. There's other evidence too. The archaeological record shows some interesting patterns around the time of Toba. In India, there are sites where you can see human occupation before the Toba ash layer and then again after it. But there's a gap, a period where the sites were abandoned, people left or died, and it took time before anyone came back. In Africa, there are similar gaps in the record. Not everywhere, but in enough places to suggest that human populations were struggling. The tools and artifacts that are found after Toba are sometimes different from the ones found before, suggesting that some knowledge or traditions were lost during the bottleneck. But not everything points to a catastrophe. Some sites show continuous occupation right through the Toba period. Some researchers argue that this means the impact wasn't as severe as the catastrophe theory suggests. If some groups survived without major disruption, how bad could it really have been? The answer might be that it varied by location. The areas closest to Toba were devastated. The areas farther away might have been spared the worst of it. Maybe the volcanic winter was patchy, with some regions hit harder than others. Maybe some groups got lucky, living in places where the effects were milder. Or maybe humans were just more resilient than we think. Maybe even in the worst hit areas, some people found ways to survive. They adapted, they innovated, they held on until things got better. This is what humans do. We're adaptable, it's our superpower. We can live in deserts, in frozen tundras, in dense jungles, in high mountains. We can survive on fish, on fruit, on roots, on meat. We can make shelters from snow, from leaves, from animal skins, from mud. We're generalists, capable of thriving in almost any environment. That adaptability is probably what saved us during Toba. The groups that could switch to new food sources, that could move to new territories, that could innovate new tools or strategies, those were the ones that survived. The ones that couldn't adapt died out. Natural selection in its purest form. What's haunting about this is that it could so easily have gone the other way. If the eruption had been just a little bit bigger, if the volcanic winter had lasted just a little bit longer, if a few more groups had died out, we might not be here. Humanity might have ended 74,000 years ago, another species that couldn't adapt fast enough, couldn't survive the changing conditions, couldn't make it through the bottleneck. But we did make it. By luck or skill or sheer stubbornness, we survived. And not only did we survive, we thrived. We came out of the bottleneck stronger, more innovative, more capable. We spread across the planet, we built civilizations, we became the dominant species on Earth. All because a few thousand people refused to give up during the darkest period in human history. Let's talk about what it means to almost go extinct, what it does to a species, to a culture, to the survivors. Because the Toba catastrophe wasn't just an event. It was a trauma. A species-wide trauma that might still echo in our collective unconscious. Think about the survivors, the people who lived through the volcanic winter, who watched most of their family and friends die, who struggled for years in a world that was actively trying to kill them. They would have been changed by that experience. They would have carried the memory of it for the rest of their lives. And they would have passed that memory on to their children. Not just as stories, but as behaviors, as caution, as a deep-seated fear of the world ending. Some psychologists and anthropologists think this is where our tendency toward anxiety comes from. Our constant worry about the future, our need to prepare for disaster, our fear of scarcity. These might be evolutionary hangovers from the Toba bottleneck, traits that helped our ancestors survive but that now manifest as free-floating anxiety in a world that's relatively safe and abundant. We're programmed to expect catastrophe because for our ancestors, catastrophe came. It nearly killed them all. The ones who were anxious, who prepared, who didn't take safety for granted, they were the ones who survived. Their genes are our genes. Their fears are our fears. This is speculative, of course. We can't prove that modern anxiety is connected to a 74,000-year-old volcanic eruption. But it's an interesting idea. The notion that our psychology might still carry scars from events that happened long before civilization, long before writing, long before we even thought of ourselves as a single species with a shared history. What we do know for certain is that Toba changed us. It changed our genetic makeup. It changed our distribution across the planet. It possibly changed our behavior and our culture. We're different because of Toba. The question is, how different? Some scientists think Toba was the trigger for the development of modern human behavior. Before Toba, humans were smart but relatively simple. We had basic tools, basic social structures, basic culture. After Toba, we started to see an explosion of innovation. Better tools, art, jewelry, complex social networks, long-distance trade. It's like something clicked in the human brain. Or maybe it was forced to click. Maybe the only way to survive Toba was to think differently, to plan differently, to cooperate differently. Maybe the groups that had those capabilities survived and the ones that didn't died out. This would be a form of selection, not for physical traits like strength or speed, but for cognitive traits like creativity, planning, cooperation. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck would have been selected for intelligence and social ability. They would have been the smartest, most adaptable, most cooperative humans who'd ever lived, and their children would inherit those traits. There's some evidence for this in the archaeological record. The period after Toba, starting around 70,000 years ago, is when we see the first clear signs of modern human behavior. Art appears. We find beads made from shells, ochre used for body paint, cave paintings. We find more sophisticated tools. Blades, points, specialized tools for specific tasks. We find evidence of long-distance exchange networks. Shells from the coast found hundreds of miles inland. Stone from one region being worked into tools in another. This suggests people were traveling, trading, communicating across large distances. We find burials with grave goods. People being buried with tools, jewelry, food. This suggests belief in an afterlife, in spiritual concepts, in a worldview that goes beyond simple survival. All of this appears or becomes much more common right after Toba. It could be a coincidence. Or it could be that Toba was the crucible that forged modern humanity. The disaster that forced us to become what we are. Let's talk about what would happen if a Toba-sized eruption happened today. Not to be alarmist, but to understand what we'd be facing, because it could happen. Toba could erupt again. Yellowstone could erupt. Any of the world's supervolcanoes could go off with little warning. What would we do? The first priority would be evacuation. If scientists detected the warning signs, if they saw the ground swelling, the earthquakes increasing, the gases venting, they'd call for an evacuation of the surrounding area. For Yellowstone, that would mean evacuating parts of Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. Millions of people would need to move. Where would they go? How would we house them? How would we feed them? These are questions we don't have good answers to. After the initial eruption, the ash would be the main concern. Volcanic ash isn't like snow. It doesn't melt. It's made of tiny particles of glass and rock. It's heavy. It clogs machinery. It contaminates water. It makes breathing difficult. If you got a few inches of ash on your roof, the roof might collapse. If you got it in your car's engine, the engine would seize up. If you breathed too much of it, your lungs would be damaged. Communities within a few hundred miles of the eruption would be buried. Infrastructure would fail. Roads would become impassable. Power would go out. Water treatment plants would stop working. People would be on their own, trying to survive with whatever supplies they had. Beyond the immediate blast zone, the main threat would be the volcanic winter. Ash in the stratosphere would block sunlight. Temperatures would drop. Growing seasons would be disrupted. Crops would fail. Within a year, we'd be facing a global food crisis. Our modern agricultural system depends on stable climate conditions. We plant crops at specific times, expecting specific weather patterns. If those patterns change suddenly, the crops die, and we don't have much buffer. Most countries keep only a few months' worth of grain in reserve. If harvests failed for multiple years, we'd run out of food. Then there's the social and political fallout. When food becomes scarce, people panic, they hoard, they fight. Countries close their borders. Trade breaks down. The global cooperation we'd need to survive the crisis would be undermined by fear and nationalism. We've seen hints of this during smaller disasters. The COVID-19 pandemic showed us how quickly international cooperation can break down when each country feels threatened. And that was just a disease. Imagine if it was a global food shortage. Imagine if every country was struggling to feed its own people and had nothing to spare for anyone else. There would be mass migrations. People fleeing areas where food is scarce, trying to reach areas where food is available. Those migrations would lead to conflicts, potentially wars. History is full of examples of climate change or food scarcity leading to violence. The Syrian civil war, for instance, was partially triggered by a drought that forced rural populations into cities, creating tensions that eventually erupted into war. Now scale that up to a global level. That's what we'd be facing after a supervolcanic eruption. The best-case scenario is that we'd pull together, that countries would share resources, coordinate responses, ration food equitably, support each other through the crisis. We'd use our technology and our knowledge to find ways to adapt. Maybe we'd develop new crops that could grow in colder conditions. Maybe we'd build massive greenhouses. Maybe we'd find ways to supplement food production with synthetic nutrition. The worst-case scenario is that civilization collapses, that the complex systems we depend on break down irreparably, that the crisis triggers wars, famines, epidemics, that the global population crashes not as far as it did during Toba, but significantly, that it takes generations to rebuild. Which scenario is more likely? Honestly, it's hard to say. It would depend on how severe the eruption was, how long the volcanic winter lasted, and how well we responded. We have advantages the survivors of Toba didn't have, but we also have vulnerabilities they didn't have. One thing we could do is prepare. We could build up larger food reserves. We could develop contingency plans for global disasters. We could invest in technologies that would help us survive a volcanic winter. Cold-resistant crops, artificial growing environments, alternative food sources. But we're not doing much of any of that. Most governments don't plan for low-probability, high-impact events like supervolcanic eruptions. It's too abstract, too far in the future, too expensive. They focus on more immediate threats, more likely disasters. And in some ways, that makes sense. You have to prioritize. You can't prepare for everything. But it also leaves us vulnerable. If a supervolcano did erupt, we'd be scrambling to respond, making it up as we went along, hoping we could adapt fast enough. Just like our ancestors did 74,000 years ago. The story of Toba should be a wake-up call. It should remind us that the Earth is capable of throwing disasters at us that we can barely imagine, and that our survival depends on our ability to adapt, to cooperate, to think long-term. The survivors of Toba didn't have science or technology. They couldn't predict what was going to happen or why. They just had to endure. We have more tools. We have more knowledge. We should be using them to make sure that if disaster strikes again, we don't just survive, we thrive. But that requires thinking differently about risk, about preparedness, about our relationship with the planet. It requires acknowledging that we're not as safe as we think we are, that the systems we've built, as impressive as they are still fragile, still vulnerable to disruption. The geological record is full of catastrophes. Asteroid impacts, ice ages, megadroughts, supervolcanic eruptions. These events have shaped life on Earth, driving extinctions, forcing adaptations, creating the conditions for new species to emerge. We're part of that story. We're one of the species shaped by catastrophe. And there's no reason to think the catastrophes have stopped. Let's return to the human side of this story, to the people who lived through Toba and what they might have felt, thought, experienced. Because numbers and data only tell part of the story. The rest is about the lived experience of disaster. Imagine you're a child during the Toba catastrophe. You're maybe 6 or 7 years old. You don't understand what's happening. You just know that your parents are scared, that there's not enough food, that your baby sister died last month and everyone cried, but then you had to keep moving. You're hungry all the time. Your stomach hurts. You're cold even though you're wearing every scrap of clothing and hide you own. The sky has been dark for as long as you can remember. You've forgotten what the sun looks like. Sometimes you wonder if it was ever really there or if you just imagined it. You walk with your family, your band, moving from one place to another, always looking for food, for shelter, for any sign that things might get better. Sometimes you find other groups. Sometimes they're friendly, and you share what little you have. Sometimes they're hostile, and there's shouting and fighting, and you have to run. You learn not to ask questions, not to complain. You learn to stay quiet, to keep up, to eat whatever you're given, even if it tastes bad or makes you sick. You learn that the world is hard and that safety is temporary, and that the people you love might not be there tomorrow. This is what childhood would have been like for the few thousand children who survived Toba. Not play and learning and security, just survival. Day after day, year after year. And those children grew up. They became the adults who rebuilt human populations. They had their own children, and they taught them the lessons they'd learned. Be prepared. Don't waste. Share with your group. Don't trust outsiders too easily. Watch the sky. Listen for danger. Always have a backup plan. These lessons would have been passed down through generations. They would have become culture, tradition, the way things are done. And maybe, in some form, they're still with us. The caution, the anxiety, the sense that disaster is always just around the corner. Or maybe there's another lesson. Maybe the survivors of Toba also learned about resilience, about the human capacity to endure, about the fact that even when things seem hopeless, you keep going. You wake up the next day, you find food, you take care of each other, you tell stories to keep your spirits up. You find moments of joy even in the darkness, because that's what humans do. We endure, we adapt, we find meaning even in suffering. The survivors of Toba prove that. They didn't give up. They could have. They could have just sat down and waited to die. But they didn't. They fought for every day, every scrap of food, every small victory. And eventually, things got better. The ash settled. The sun came back. Plants grew. Animals returned. Life continued. And the survivors, the ones who'd made it through the worst, they had children. They built new communities. They created new traditions. They looked at the world with different eyes, eyes that had seen the darkness and come out the other side. Think about what it must have been like when the volcanic winter finally ended, when the first rays of strong sunlight broke through the ash-filled sky after years of dimness. When the temperature started to rise, slowly at first, then more noticeably. When the first green shoots appeared through the grey ash layer that covered everything. The survivors would have been different people by then, hardened by years of struggle, marked by loss, but also stronger, more capable, more determined. They would have looked at that new growth, at those first signs of recovery, and felt something they hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope that keeps you going through the worst times, but genuine belief that things might actually get better, that life might return to something approaching normal, that their children might have a future that wasn't just about survival. And they would have been right to hope, because over the following generations, as the climate stabilized and ecosystems recovered, human populations began to grow again. Slowly at first. The bottleneck had been severe and it took time to rebuild. But humans are good at rebuilding. It's what we do. We take the pieces of what's left and we make something new. Sometimes something better than what came before. The archaeological record shows us this recovery. We see sites being reoccupied. We see new sites being established in areas that had been abandoned. We see trade networks being re-established and expanding beyond their previous reach. We see innovation accelerating. The humans who came out of the Toba bottleneck weren't the same as the humans who went in. They'd been tested. They'd been selected. They'd been forged in the fires of catastrophe. And they brought that experience forward into everything they did. Let's talk about the other supervolcanoes in the world today, because Toba isn't unique. It's just the most recent major example. There are at least 20 known supervolcanic systems on Earth. Some are more active than others. Some are being closely monitored. Others are in remote locations where we have limited data. Yellowstone is probably the most famous. It sits under Wyoming and parts of Montana and Idaho. The caldera is huge, about 34 miles by 45 miles. It's erupted 3 times in the last 2 million years. The last eruption was about 640,000 years ago. That's a long time, but it's still considered an active system. The ground in Yellowstone rises and falls as the magma chamber below fills and empties. Geysers and hot springs mark where heat from below reaches the surface. Earthquakes are common, usually small ones, but they're a constant reminder that this is a living, active volcanic system. If Yellowstone erupted tomorrow as a supervolcanic event, it would devastate the American West. Ash would bury everything within a few hundred miles. The ash cloud would spread east, carried by prevailing winds. Cities like Denver, Kansas City, maybe even Chicago would be affected. Agriculture across the Great Plains would be wiped out. And that's just the local effects. The global impacts would be similar to what happened with Toba. volcanic winter, crop failures, food shortages, climate disruption lasting for years. Scientists monitor Yellowstone constantly. They measure ground deformation using GPS stations. They track earthquake activity with seismometers. They sample gases coming out of the hot springs and fumaroles. They're looking for any signs that the magma chamber is becoming more active, that pressure is building, that an eruption might be coming. So far, there's no indication that a major eruption is imminent. Yellowstone erupts on roughly 600,000-year cycles based on its history. We're just past the 640,000-year mark since the last one, which means we could be entering the window for the next eruption. But that window could be 10,000 years wide or 100,000. We don't really know. Then there's Campi Flegrei in Italy. It's less famous than Yellowstone, but potentially just as dangerous. It sits right next to Naples, a city of nearly 1 million people. The caldera is about 8 miles across. It last erupted in 1538, a small eruption by supervolcanic standards, but it's capable of much larger events. About 40,000 years ago, it had a massive eruption that covered much of the Mediterranean in ash. That eruption might have contributed to the extinction of Neanderthals in Europe, though the evidence for that is debated. Today, Campi Flegrei is showing signs of unrest. The ground has been rising and falling for decades. In the 1980s, the uplift was so significant that it damaged buildings in the town of Pozzuoli, which sits inside the caldera. Earthquakes are common. The Italian government has evacuation plans in place, but evacuating 1 million people from Naples and the surrounding areas would be an enormous challenge. Then there's Lake Taupo in New Zealand. It erupted about 1,800 years ago in what's known as the Hatapi eruption. That wasn't a full supervolcanic event, but it was big enough to devastate the central North Island and send ash across the Pacific. The caldera there is capable of much larger eruptions. There's Ira Caldera in Japan, Long Valley in California, Valles Caldera in New Mexico. Each of these systems has erupted in the past. Each could erupt again in the future. Some are more likely than others. Some are being monitored more closely. But all of them represent potential threats. The thing about supervolcanoes is that we can't prevent them. We can't stop an eruption once it starts. All we can do is monitor them, try to predict when they might erupt, and prepare as best we can. And even our best preparation might not be enough if the eruption is large enough and lasts long enough. Let's think about what preparation would actually look like for a modern supervolcanic eruption. First, there's the monitoring. We need to keep watching these systems, investing in the equipment and personnel to track any changes. That means maintaining networks of seismometers, GPS stations, gas sensors. It means funding the scientists who analyze the data and look for patterns. It means taking the warnings seriously when they come. If scientists say a supervolcano is showing signs of an imminent eruption, we need to act. That means evacuating people from the danger zone. That means activating emergency response plans. That means coordinating across multiple government agencies and international borders. Then there's the long-term preparation, building up strategic reserves of food and supplies, developing technologies that could help us survive a volcanic winter, cold-resistant crops that could grow with less sunlight, greenhouse systems that could produce food indoors, alternative protein sources that don't depend on traditional agriculture. Some of this is already being worked on, but not because of supervolcanoes. It's being developed for other reasons: climate change, population growth, food security. But the technologies could be useful in a volcanic winter scenario too. We should also be thinking about how to maintain social order and cooperation during a global crisis. How do we prevent panic? How do we ensure resources are distributed fairly? How do we keep people working together instead of turning on each other? These are hard questions, without easy answers. They require planning, practice, preparation, things we're not doing nearly enough of. The COVID-19 pandemic showed us some of what we're capable of. We developed vaccines in record time. We implemented lockdowns and travel restrictions. We found ways to keep essential services running even as the world shut down. But it also showed us our weaknesses, the hoarding and panic buying, the breakdowns in cooperation, the conspiracy theories and misinformation, the failure to coordinate effectively across borders. A supervolcanic eruption would be a more severe test. It would last longer. It would have more severe economic impacts. It would strain our systems in ways a pandemic doesn't. And we need to be thinking about that now, before it happens, not scrambling to respond after the fact. Let's come back to the human story one more time, because that's really what this is about. Not the geology or the climate science or the disaster preparedness, but the humans, the people who lived through Toba 74,000 years ago, and the people who might have to live through the next supervolcanic eruption whenever it comes. The survivors of Toba didn't have the advantages we have. They didn't have science to explain what was happening. They didn't have technology to help them adapt. They didn't have global communication networks or international aid organizations. They just had themselves and each other. And that was enough. They survived on knowledge passed down through generations. How to find water, how to track animals, how to identify edible plants, how to make fire, how to build shelter. Skills that had been honed over hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution. They survived on cooperation. Small bands working together, sharing resources, protecting each other. They couldn't have made it alone. No individual human could survive something like Toba. It took groups, communities, working together toward a common goal of survival. They survived on hope, the belief that things would get better, that the darkness wouldn't last forever, that their children would have a future. Without that hope, they would have given up. Hope kept them going through the worst times, and they survived on sheer stubbornness, the refusal to accept that this was the end, the determination to live one more day, to find one more meal, to take one more step. That stubbornness is built into us. It's part of what makes us human. We don't give up easily. We fight, we adapt, we endure. Those same qualities are still in us today. We've built a world that seems very different from the one our ancestors inhabited 74,000 years ago. We have cities and technology and global systems, but underneath all of that, we're still the same species. We still have the same capacity for cooperation, innovation, hope, and stubbornness. If we had to, we could survive another Toba. It wouldn't be easy. There would be tremendous suffering and loss. But we could do it. We have better tools now, better knowledge, better ability to coordinate and plan. And we have the example of our ancestors who survived the first time with so much less. That should give us confidence. Not false confidence that leads to complacency, but realistic confidence that acknowledges the risks while also recognizing our strengths. We can prepare, we can monitor the threats, we can develop the technologies and systems that would help us survive. We can plan for how to maintain cooperation and social order during a crisis. We can do all of these things. The question is whether we will. Whether we'll take the threat seriously enough to invest in preparation now before disaster strikes, or whether we'll wait until it's too late and then scramble to respond. The story of Toba suggests we should prepare. It reminds us that catastrophes happen, that the earth doesn't care about our plans or our civilizations, that nature operates on timescales and power scales that dwarf anything humans can control. But it also reminds us that we're resilient, that we've survived worse, that we have strengths we don't even know about until we're tested. The survivors of Toba were ordinary people. They weren't superhumans. They weren't specially gifted or chosen. They were just people who refused to give up, who kept going even when everything seemed hopeless, who found ways to survive and eventually to thrive. We're their descendants. We carry their genes and their legacy. And if they could survive the worst catastrophe in human history, with nothing but stone tools and their determination, then we can survive whatever comes next. We owe it to them to remember that, to honor their struggle by being prepared for our own. To pass on to the next generation the same legacy they passed to us. The knowledge that humans can endure anything, that we're stronger together than apart, that hope and stubbornness and cooperation can carry us through even the darkest times, that no matter how bad things get, we keep going, because that's what humans do. That's who we are, the children of Toba, the descendants of survivors, the people who refuse to quit. That's the legacy of Toba, not just the genetic bottleneck or the archaeological evidence, but the proof that humans can survive anything, that we're tougher than we think, that we have reserves of strength and creativity and cooperation that we don't even know about until we're tested. 74,000 years later, we're still here. We're not just surviving, we're thriving. We've built a world that the survivors of Toba couldn't have imagined. Cities, technology, art, science, all of it, growing from that tiny population that refused to die. We owe them something. We owe them the commitment to remember that survival isn't guaranteed, that the world can change, that we need to be prepared, not just for war or economics or politics, but for the big stuff, the planetary scale events that can threaten our entire species. We owe them the wisdom to use our advantages wisely, to not take our stability for granted, to build systems that are resilient, that can withstand shocks, that can help us survive the next catastrophe when it comes. Let's think about the spiritual and psychological dimensions of surviving a catastrophe like Toba. Because it's not just about physical survival. It's about maintaining your humanity in conditions that strip away everything you thought was permanent. The survivors of Toba would have had to grapple with profound questions. Why did this happen? Why did some people survive while others died? What does it mean to keep living when everything you knew is gone? These aren't just philosophical puzzles. They're urgent, practical questions that would have affected how people made decisions, how they treated each other, how they found the will to keep going. Some survivors might have turned to spiritual explanations. Maybe they believed the eruption was punishment from angry gods. Maybe they developed new rituals to appease those gods, to ensure the disaster wouldn't happen again. Maybe they created new myths to explain the darkness, stories that would be passed down for generations until the original event was forgotten, but the fear remained. Other survivors might have become more pragmatic. If the world could change so dramatically without warning, then the only thing you could count on was yourself and your group. Trust became more important. Reciprocity became essential. The bonds between band members would have been everything. Your survival depended on other people being willing to share with you, to protect you, to include you in their group. And that would have shaped human social behavior going forward. We became more cooperative not because cooperation is morally good, but because the people who cooperated survived, and the ones who didn't died out. The trauma of Toba might have made us more empathetic, more attuned to the suffering of others, more willing to help because we remembered what it was like to need help. Or it might have made us more suspicious, more defensive, more likely to see outsiders as threats. Probably it did both. Different groups responded in different ways, creating different cultures, different traditions, different ways of being human. And we're still living with those differences today. The timeline of human migration after Toba is fascinating because it shows how catastrophe can actually drive expansion. Before Toba, most humans lived in Africa. There might have been small populations in the Middle East and parts of Asia, but the main human homeland was East Africa. After Toba, within just a few thousand years, humans had spread to almost every corner of the world. We reached Australia by about 65,000 years ago. We were in Europe by 45,000 years ago. We made it to the Americas by at least 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. This rapid expansion suggests that the bottleneck didn't just reduce our numbers, it changed our behavior. Maybe the survivors realized they couldn't rely on their traditional territories anymore. Those territories had failed them during the crisis. The animals had died, the plants had withered, the familiar landscapes had been buried under ash. So they moved, they explored. They took risks they might not have taken before, because staying put felt just as dangerous as leaving. Or maybe the population pressure after the bottleneck drove migration. As human numbers started to recover, groups split up. Some stayed in the ancestral territories. Others moved to new areas looking for resources that weren't already claimed. Each generation pushed a little farther, following game animals, following coastlines, following rivers into new lands. The human diaspora that resulted is one of the great success stories of our species. We adapted to every environment we encountered: hot deserts and frozen tundras, dense jungles and open grasslands, mountains and islands and everything in between. We developed different technologies for different environments, different clothing, different shelters, different hunting strategies. We diversified in ways that made us collectively more resilient. If a disaster struck one region, humans in other regions would survive. We'd learned that lesson from Toba. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, spread out. Diversify. Make sure that no single event can wipe out the whole species. That strategy has served us well. We've survived ice ages, droughts, plagues, wars. We've survived because we're everywhere, because we're adaptable, because we don't give up. And it all traces back to those few thousand survivors of Toba who decided that the best way to honor the dead was to live, to spread out, to fill the world with humans again. There's something profound about looking at modern humans and seeing the shadow of Toba in our genetics, our behavior, our psychology. When you feel anxious about the future, when you stockpile supplies just in case, when you feel the need to prepare for disasters that probably won't happen, you're not being irrational. You're listening to instincts that were forged 74,000 years ago in the fires of the worst catastrophe our species has ever faced. When you feel the urge to connect with others, to build community, to help your neighbors, that's not just social conditioning. That's evolution. The people who built strong communities, who helped each other, who worked together, they were the ones who survived. Their genes are your genes. Their instincts are your instincts. When you look at the night sky and feel small, when you think about the vastness of time and the insignificance of your individual life, remember that your ancestors looked at that same sky during the volcanic winter and felt something similar. But they also felt determination. They felt hope. They felt the weight of responsibility to survive, to pass on their knowledge, to ensure that their children would have a future. You're the fulfillment of that hope. You're the proof that they succeeded. Every human alive today is a testament to the courage and resilience of those survivors. We're all children of catastrophe. We're all descended from people who refused to let the world end. And that's something worth remembering. Not to make us fearful, but to make us confident. We come from tough stock. We're built to survive. We have within us the same strength that carried our ancestors through the darkness 74,000 years ago. Whatever challenges we face in our own lives, whatever obstacles seem insurmountable, We can overcome them. We have the proof written in our DNA, because it will come. Maybe not in our lifetimes, maybe not for thousands of years, but eventually something will happen. A volcano, an asteroid, a climate shift, something. And when it does, we need to be ready. Not just physically, but psychologically. We need to remember that humans have survived worse, that our ancestors made it through Toba with nothing but stone tools and their wits, that we have so much more than they did. We have knowledge, technology, global networks. If they could survive, so can we. But we have to choose to. We have to decide that survival matters, that the future matters, that the generations who come after us deserve a chance, just like we got a chance because a few thousand people 74,000 years ago refused to give up. That's the real story of Toba. Not just the eruption or the climate change or the near extinction, but the human response, the refusal to quit, the determination to keep going even when all hope seems lost. It's a story about the best of what we can be: resilient, creative, cooperative, working together to overcome impossible odds, finding ways to survive and even thrive in conditions that should have killed us. We're the descendants of survivors. That's in our DNA, literally. Every one of us carries genes that were tested in the fires of Toba and came through. We're built to endure, built to adapt, built to survive. And maybe, just maybe, that's something worth remembering, especially now, especially in our own uncertain times. The world feels fragile sometimes. The climate is changing. Resources are strained. Conflicts are brewing. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, to feel like things are falling apart. But our ancestors faced worse. They faced the end of the world, and they survived. They built a future. They gave us a chance. We can do the same. We can face our challenges. We can adapt. We can work together. We can survive whatever comes next and build a future for the generations after us. That's the promise of Toba. Not that the world won't change, but that we can change with it. Not that disaster won't come, but that we can survive it. Not that things will be easy, but that we're strong enough to handle hard. 74,000 years ago, the sky went dark. The world turned cold. Almost everyone died, but not everyone. A few thousand humans held on. They endured the worst catastrophe our species has ever faced. They survived. They rebuilt. They became us. And if they could do that, if they could come through something that terrible and still find hope, still build a future, still create beauty and meaning and life, then what can't we do? What challenge is too big? What disaster is too overwhelming? We're made of the same stuff they were. We have the same resilience, the same creativity, the same stubborn refusal to quit. We're the children of survivors. All of us. Every single one. That's the legacy of Toba. That's what those few thousand people left us. Not just their genes, but their spirit, their strength, their hope. And as long as we remember that, as long as we honor that legacy by living with courage and creativity and care for each other, we'll be okay. We'll make it through whatever comes. Just like they did. Just like humans always have. So that's the story of Toba. The volcano that nearly ended humanity 74,000 years ago. The catastrophe that brought us to the edge of extinction. And somehow, impossibly, we survived. It's a story about the fragility of life and the resilience of the human spirit. About how close we came to vanishing forever and how a few thousand people refused to let that happen. It's a reminder that the earth is old and powerful and doesn't care about us, that volcanoes will erupt and climates will change and disasters will come. But it's also a reminder that we're tougher than we think, that we can adapt to almost anything, that we can find hope even in the darkest times. The survivors of Toba lived through hell. They watched the sky turn black. They felt the world grow cold. They buried their friends and family. They struggled for years in conditions that should have killed them, but they didn't give up. They found ways to survive. They worked together. They innovated. They endured. And because they endured, we're here. Every one of us carries their legacy. Every one of us is proof that humans can survive anything if we just refuse to quit. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember this. You're descended from survivors, from people who faced the end of the world and came through it. You've got that strength in you, that resilience, that stubborn hope that things can get better, even when they seem hopeless. The world will throw challenges at you, some small, some large, but you can handle them because you're human. And humans don't give up. We never have. We never will. Sleep well, and if you enjoyed this, consider subscribing. I make videos like this to help you relax and maybe learn something interesting while you're falling asleep. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing people from all over the world finding these videos. Thanks for listening. And remember, no matter how dark things get, the sun always comes back. It came back after Toba, and it'll come back for you too. Good night. But there's more to this story. Much more, because Toba wasn't just an isolated event in human history. It was part of a larger pattern, a cycle of catastrophes that have shaped life on Earth for millions of years. And understanding that pattern, understanding what Toba really means in the grand scheme of things, that's where this story gets even deeper. Let's talk about the other species that went through Toba alongside humans, because we weren't the only ones affected. Every living thing on the planet felt the impact of that eruption. And for many species, the results were just as devastating as they were for us. Take the great apes, our closest relatives, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans. They were living in Africa and Southeast Asia when Toba erupted. The genetic evidence shows that they went through bottlenecks too. Their populations crashed. The orangutans living closest to the eruption in Indonesia were hit particularly hard. Their population dropped so low that they've never fully recovered. Today, orangutans have even less genetic diversity than humans. They're critically endangered, with only a few tens of thousands left in the wild. Part of that is modern habitat destruction, but part of it traces back to Toba. They never bounced back from that ancient catastrophe the way humans did. Other primates show similar patterns. Genetic studies of various monkey species reveal population crashes around the same time. Some species went extinct entirely. We know they existed before Toba from fossil evidence, but they disappear from the record afterward. They didn't make it through the bottleneck. The volcanic winter killed them off completely. Birds were affected too. Migratory species that depended on seasonal patterns would have been thrown into chaos when those patterns broke down. Birds that flew south for the winter would have found that south was just as cold as north. Birds that timed their breeding to coincide with spring blooms would have found no spring, no blooms, no food for their chicks. We don't have as much genetic data for bird populations from that time, but we can infer from what we know about volcanic eruptions in recorded history. When Mount Tambora erupted in 1815, bird populations across the northern hemisphere crashed. Migration patterns were disrupted. Breeding seasons failed. It took years for populations to recover, and that was from a much smaller eruption than Toba. Marine life might have been somewhat protected from the immediate effects of the volcanic winter, since the ocean's thermal mass keeps water temperatures more stable than air temperatures. But even the oceans weren't safe. The ash that fell into the water changed the chemistry. It made the water more acidic, more turbid. It blocked sunlight from reaching the depths where photosynthetic plankton live. Plankton populations would have crashed, and with them, the entire marine food web. Fish that fed on plankton died. Fish that fed on those fish died, all the way up the chain to the great whales and the apex predators. We can see evidence of this in marine sediment cores. The layers from around 74,000 years ago show changes in the types of microfossils present. Some species disappear, others become more common. The whole ecosystem shifted in response to the catastrophe, and it took thousands of years to stabilize again. Land mammals faced perhaps the worst of it. Large herbivores like elephants, rhinos, and giant ground sloths depended on abundant plant life. When the plants died back during the volcanic winter, these animals had nowhere to turn. They couldn't switch to other food sources. They couldn't migrate fast enough to find areas that were still productive. They starved in massive numbers. The predators that depended on those herbivores starved too. Big cats, wolves, bears, all of them struggled. Some populations went extinct. Others survived in tiny refugia, pockets of land where conditions weren't quite as bad, and slowly rebuilt their numbers over millennia. Genetic studies of modern elephants, for instance, show evidence of a severe bottleneck around the time of Toba. The African elephant population crashed to maybe a few thousand individuals. They survived, obviously, but they lost most of their genetic diversity in the process. Today's elephants are all descended from that small group of survivors, just like humans are. There's something humbling about that. We tend to think of the Toba catastrophe as a human story, but it was so much bigger than us. It was a planetary event that reshaped life in every ecosystem, on every continent. And in a strange way, it leveled the playing field. Before Toba, humans were just another species of ape, nothing special, just trying to survive alongside all the other species. After Toba, we were still just another species of ape, but we'd been through something that gave us an edge. The disaster had selected for the traits that would eventually make us dominant: intelligence, adaptability, cooperation. While other species struggled to recover, we flourished. Not immediately, but over the following millennia, humans began to outcompete other species in ways we never had before. We spread into new territories faster. We developed better tools more quickly. We adapted to new environments more effectively. Was this because Toba had made us smarter, or because it had killed off so many of our competitors? Probably both. The ecological niches left empty by extinct species were openings for humans to exploit. And the cognitive abilities we'd developed to survive the catastrophe gave us the tools we needed to exploit those niches. Let's dig deeper into the archaeology of the post-Toba world, because the physical evidence tells us a lot about how humans actually changed. Before Toba, human tools were relatively simple. We're talking about the Middle Stone Age in Africa. People were making hand axes, scrapers, basic flaked stone tools. The technology had been relatively stable for tens of thousands of years. Not much innovation, not much change. Then Toba happens, and in the thousands of years immediately afterward, we see an explosion of new technologies. Blades appear, long, thin flakes of stone that are much more efficient than the old hand axes. You can get more cutting edge per pound of stone, which matters when you're struggling to survive and can't waste anything. Microliths appear, tiny stone tools that could be hafted onto wooden or bone handles to make composite tools, spears with stone points, arrows, harpoons. This is sophisticated technology that requires planning, precision, and knowledge transmission from one generation to the next. We see the first definitive evidence of bone tools. Needles for sewing, which implies tailored clothing, which implies people were adapting to colder climates or planning ahead for seasonal changes. Awls for making holes in leather. Fish hooks for catching marine resources. Art appears in the archaeological record around this time too. The oldest known beads are made from shells and date to about 75,000 years ago, right after Toba. These shells were collected from the coast and carried inland, sometimes hundreds of miles. That tells us people were traveling long distances, maintaining connections across vast territories. The beads themselves tell us people were thinking symbolically, using objects to represent ideas or status or identity. This is abstract thinking, something we don't see clear evidence for before Toba. Ochre, a red mineral pigment, starts showing up more frequently in archaeological sites. People were grinding it into powder, mixing it with fat or water to make paint. What were they painting? We don't know for sure. Bodies, probably, in ritual or ceremonial contexts. Maybe they were painting on perishable materials like wood or leather that haven't survived. But the point is, they were creating art, expressing themselves in non-utilitarian ways. Cave paintings come later, starting around 40,000 years ago in Europe, but the practice probably has older roots in Africa that we just haven't found yet. The technology and the cognitive ability to create representational art existed after Toba in ways they apparently didn't before. Burial practices change too. Before Toba, we have very little evidence of intentional burial. Dead bodies were left where they fell or maybe placed in caves, but there's no clear ritual component. After Toba, we start finding graves. Bodies deliberately positioned, sometimes with grave goods, tools, ornaments, ochre. This suggests belief in an afterlife, or at least a sense that death means something beyond just the end of biological function. These are all signs of behavioral modernity, the package of traits that makes humans uniquely human. Language, symbolic thought, long-term planning, cultural transmission, ritual, and religion. All of this seems to crystallize in the period right after Toba. Why? The traditional view is that these behaviors evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, and we just happen to see them appearing in the archaeological record around 70,000 years ago, because that's when the evidence preservation gets better. But another possibility is that Toba acted as a catalyst. The disaster created conditions where these behaviors became essential for survival. The groups that had language could coordinate better, plan better, share knowledge better. They survived. The groups that didn't have those capabilities died out. The groups that could think symbolically, that could use abstract concepts to organize their social world, to create shared meaning, to motivate collective action, they had an advantage. They could get people to work together toward long-term goals, to share resources equitably, to maintain social bonds, even under extreme stress. The groups that had burial rituals that honored their dead, that created ceremonies and traditions, they had stronger social cohesion. They had ways of processing trauma, of finding meaning in loss, of maintaining hope when everything seemed hopeless. These cultural innovations weren't just nice to have. They were survival tools, just as important as stone blades or bone needles. And Toba selected for them with the same brutal efficiency that it selected for physical adaptations in other species. This is cultural evolution operating on the same principles as biological evolution. Variation, selection, inheritance. Different groups tried different cultural solutions to the problem of survival. The solutions that worked were passed on to the next generation. The solutions that didn't work disappeared along with the groups that relied on them. Over thousands of years, this process refined human culture into something uniquely powerful and adaptable. And it all traces back to Toba, to the crucible of that catastrophe. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed as much, the psychological and neurological changes that might have occurred, because extreme stress, especially prolonged extreme stress, can actually change brain structure and function. We know this from modern studies. People who go through severe trauma, who live through wars or famines or natural disasters, they show measurable changes in brain areas related to stress response, memory, and emotional regulation. The hippocampus, which is involved in memory formation, often shrinks in response to chronic stress. The amygdala, which processes fear and emotion, becomes hyperactive. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for planning and decision-making, can be impaired. These changes can be passed down to children, not genetically exactly, but epigenetically. Trauma can alter how genes are expressed, and those alterations can be inherited. The children of Holocaust survivors, for instance, show different stress hormone profiles than people whose families weren't affected. They're more prone to anxiety and PTSD, even though they never experienced the original trauma themselves. Could something similar have happened with Toba survivors? Did the stress of the volcanic winter alter their brain function in ways that persisted for generations? It's speculative, but it's worth considering. If the Toba survivors developed heightened stress responses, enhanced threat detection, better long-term planning abilities as a result of their trauma, and if those changes were partly epigenetic and could be inherited, then every human alive today might carry the neurological signature of that catastrophe. Your tendency to worry about the future, your ability to plan and prepare, your hypervigilance to potential threats. These might not just be cultural traits, they might be biological ones, written into your brain structure by the experiences of ancestors who lived 74,000 years ago. This is a controversial idea in psychology and neuroscience. The mechanisms of transgenerational trauma transmission are still being worked out, but the evidence is mounting that trauma can have effects that last beyond a single lifetime. And if any event in human history was traumatic enough to leave a lasting mark, it was Toba. Let's shift perspective for a moment and think about what the world looked like before Toba. Because we've been focusing on the catastrophe and its aftermath, but to really understand what was lost, we need to know what existed before. 75,000 years ago, Earth was in an interglacial period, a warm phase between ice ages. Africa was greener than it is today. The Sahara, now the world's largest desert, was partially covered with grasslands and lakes. Humans and animals thrived in regions that are now barren. The Middle East was a crossroads where multiple human species coexisted. Homo sapiens, Yus, had evolved in Africa about 300,000 years earlier. But we weren't alone. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans, a mysterious group we only know from a few fragments of bone and DNA, lived in Central and Eastern Asia. There might have been other species too, archaic humans that we haven't discovered yet. These different species sometimes met. Sometimes they competed. Sometimes they interbred. We know this because modern humans carry small amounts of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. Our ancestors mated with these other species and had viable offspring. Before Toba, the world was full of human diversity in a way it never has been since. Multiple species, each with their own cultures, their own technologies, their own ways of being in the world. And then Toba erupted. We don't know exactly what happened to the Neanderthals and Denisovans during the volcanic winter. They would have been affected too. Their populations would have crashed. Some groups probably went extinct. But they were already living in colder climates, already adapted to Ice Age Europe and Asia. They might have been better equipped to handle the cold than African Homo sapiens. Yet in the long run, it was Homo sapiens that survived and thrived. Neanderthals went extinct about 40,000 years ago. Denisovans disappeared around the same time. We were the only human species left. Why? What did we have that they didn't? Maybe it was the behavioral modernity that emerged after Toba. The enhanced cognitive abilities, the sophisticated culture, the better cooperation. Or maybe it was just luck. Maybe our populations happened to be in the right places when Toba hit. Places where the effects were bad, but not unsurvivable. Maybe we just got lucky. But I don't think it was all luck. I think Toba changed us in fundamental ways, gave us advantages that compounded over time until we became the dominant species on the planet. And in becoming dominant, we crowded out our relatives. There wasn't room for multiple human species in the post-Toba world. The survivors were too competitive, too successful. They spread too quickly, filled too many niches. When they encountered other human species, they outcompeted them, absorbed them through interbreeding, or drove them to extinction. Within 30,000 years of Toba, we were the last humans standing, the only survivors of a once diverse family tree. That's both triumphant and tragic. Triumphant because we made it, because we survived and thrived. Tragic because we're alone now in a way our ancestors never were. There are no other humans to compare ourselves to learn from, to exchange ideas with. We're it, the last branch on the tree. Let's talk about the myths and legends that might preserve memories of Toba, because 74,000 years is a long time, too long for oral history to preserve accurate details. But maybe, just maybe, some echo of the catastrophe survived in the stories people tell. Flood myths are nearly universal. Almost every culture has a story about a great flood that destroyed the world and killed most of humanity, with only a few survivors left to rebuild. The biblical story of Noah is the most famous in the West, but there are hundreds of others. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia, the Hindu story of Manu and the Great Fish, the Greek myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the Chinese story of Gunyu and the Great Flood, Native American flood myths from dozens of different tribes, Australian Aboriginal stories of rising waters. These myths are strikingly similar, despite coming from cultures that had no contact with each other. They all involve a catastrophic flood that wipes out humanity except for a chosen few who survive in a boat or on a mountain. They all involve the world being destroyed and then remade. They all emphasize the fragility of human civilization and the power of nature. Now, these myths might just reflect the reality that floods are common and devastating. Every culture experiences floods at some point, and it makes sense that they'd create stories about them. But what if some of these myths, especially the oldest ones, preserve a distorted memory of Toba? Not the details, obviously. Toba wasn't a flood, but the emotional core of the story, the world-ending catastrophe, the near extinction of humanity, the long period of darkness and cold. Maybe that survived, transformed and mythologized over thousands of generations. Some Australian Aboriginal stories talk about a time when the sun went away and the world grew cold, a time when the sky was covered in darkness and people had to hide underground. These stories are said to be tens of thousands of years old, passed down through oral tradition with remarkable consistency. Could they be memories of Toba? It's impossible to prove. Oral traditions change over time. They merge with other stories, pick up new details, lose old ones. But it's tantalizing to think that somewhere in these ancient myths, there might be a kernel of truth, a memory of the worst day in human history, preserved not in stone or bone, but in story. Creation myths often involve a period of darkness before the world comes into being. The world is void and formless, covered in darkness, until a creator deity brings light and order. What if these myths reflect a real period of darkness, the volcanic winter, reinterpreted through a religious lens? What if the creation of the world that the myths describe isn't the literal creation of Earth, but the recreation of human civilization after it was destroyed by catastrophe? Again, this is speculative. We can't prove it, but it's worth thinking about. Because if our myths do preserve some memory of Toba, even a distorted one, then that memory has been shaping human culture for 74,000 years. Our stories about the end of the world, about divine punishment, about the need to prepare for disaster, they might all trace back to that ancient catastrophe. Let's turn to another aspect of the Toba story, the role of refugia. Because not all places on Earth were equally affected by the volcanic winter. Some regions, by luck or geography, were spared the worst of it. These refugia became sanctuaries where life could persist while the rest of the world froze. In Africa, the coastal regions might have been refugia. The ocean moderates temperature, keeping coastal areas warmer than the interior. And the ocean provides food, shellfish, seaweed, fish, that don't depend on terrestrial plants and so wouldn't have been as affected by the collapse of land-based ecosystems. There's archaeological evidence that humans were exploiting marine resources around the time of Toba. Shell middens, heaps of discarded shells from countless meals, appear in coastal South Africa dating to about 75,000 years ago. These suggest that at least some human groups had shifted to a marine-based diet, perhaps in response to the scarcity of terrestrial food. Coastal living might have been what saved them. In Asia, there might have been refugia in the tropics, areas where the temperature didn't drop as much, where some plants continued to grow, where small populations of animals survived. The problem is, these areas are hard to study archaeologically. Many of them are now underwater, submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. The coastlines of 74,000 years ago are now beneath 100 feet of ocean. But we can make educated guesses based on climate models and the distribution of genetic diversity in modern populations. Southeast Asia shows high genetic diversity in some populations, suggesting they might have had larger populations that survived through Toba, possibly in refugia. Similarly, some parts of India might have been refugia. The Western Ghats, a mountain range along the southwestern coast of India, has unique ecosystems that might have been resilient to the volcanic winter. The idea of refugia is important because it explains how life recovered so quickly after Toba. If everything everywhere had died, recovery would have taken much longer. But if there were pockets where life persisted, those pockets could serve as sources from which species could spread back out as conditions improved. Plants growing in refugia could spread their seeds to adjacent areas. Animals in refugia could migrate back into their former ranges. Humans in refugia could have babies and send some of those babies out to explore and settle new territories. Over time, life would radiate out from these refugia, recolonizing the world. The pattern of genetic diversity in modern species supports this. Areas that were refugia tend to have higher genetic diversity because they had larger populations that survived. Areas that were recolonized later tend to have lower diversity because they were settled by small founder populations that came from the refugia. Humans show this pattern too. African populations have the highest genetic diversity. Asian and European populations have less. Native American populations have even less, consistent with them being founded by a small group that migrated from Asia. This pattern of diversity radiating out from Africa makes sense if Africa was the main refugium for humans during Toba. Most humans who survived were in Africa. From there, they spread out to the rest of the world, carrying with them a subset of the total genetic diversity. Each new population founded by migrants had less diversity than the one it came from. By the time humans reached the Americas, they were carrying only a fraction of the original African diversity. Now let's talk about a controversial hypothesis the idea that Toba might not have been as catastrophic as originally thought, because not all scientists agree on the severity of the volcanic winter or the human population bottleneck. Some researchers argue that the evidence for a global catastrophe is weaker than it first appeared. They point out that climate models of volcanic winters are uncertain. Different models give different results. Some suggest the cooling would have been severe and long-lasting. Others suggest it would have been moderate and brief. The actual climate impact depends on a lot of variables: the amount of sulfur dioxide released, the height the aerosols reached in the stratosphere, the atmospheric circulation patterns at the time. We don't know all these variables with certainty. Archaeological evidence is also mixed. While some sites show abandonment around the time of Toba, others show continuous occupation. This suggests that the impact varied regionally. Some places were devastated, others were not. If the catastrophe had been truly global and severe, we should see evidence of universal disruption. But we don't. Some researchers also question the genetic evidence for a bottleneck. They argue that the apparent loss of diversity could be explained by other factors. Population structure, for instance. If ancient human populations were divided into separate groups that didn't interbreed much, that could create patterns in modern DNA that look like a bottleneck, even if total population size never got very small. Or maybe there were multiple smaller bottlenecks over time rather than one massive one. Or maybe the bottleneck was real but not caused by Toba. Maybe it was caused by climate change, or disease, or competition with other human species, and it just happened to coincide with Toba by chance. These are valid criticisms. Science is about questioning assumptions and testing hypotheses. The Toba catastrophe theory is just that, a theory. It fits a lot of the evidence, but it's not proven beyond doubt. What we can say with certainty is that Toba erupted 74,000 years ago, and it was a massive eruption. We can say that human populations went through a genetic bottleneck sometime around that period. We can say that human behavior changed significantly in the millennia after Toba. What we can't say for certain is that Toba caused the bottleneck or the behavioral changes. The connection is plausible, well supported by some evidence, but not conclusive. And that's okay. That's how science works. We build models based on available evidence. We test those models. We refine them as new evidence comes in. Maybe future research will confirm that Toba was indeed a near-extinction event for humans. Or maybe it will show that the impact was less severe than we thought, that humans are more resilient than we gave them credit for, that we survived Toba the same way we've survived every other challenge, by being adaptable and stubborn. Either way, the story of Toba teaches us something valuable about our place in the world. Let's explore what we've learned from studying other volcanic eruptions in recorded history, because they give us a preview of what Toba might have been like. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 is the largest in recorded history. It ejected about 36 cubic miles of material, a fraction of what Toba produced, but still enormous by human standards. Tambora killed about 71,000 people directly through pyroclastic flows, ashfall, and tsunamis. But the indirect effects killed many more. The ash in the stratosphere caused the year without a summer in 1816. Snow fell in June in New England, crops failed across Europe. Famines spread. Disease followed famine. In some regions, people resorted to eating bark, grass, even each other. Riots broke out over food. Governments collapsed. It took years for agriculture to recover and for social order to be fully restored. And this was from an eruption that was maybe 1/20th the size of Toba. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 was smaller still, but its effects were global. The sound of the explosion was heard 3,000 miles away, the loudest sound in recorded history. The tsunamis it generated killed 36,000 people. The ash and aerosols in the atmosphere caused spectacular sunsets around the world for months. Global temperatures dropped by more than a degree Fahrenheit. Weather patterns were disrupted. These historical eruptions give us a baseline for understanding Toba. If Tambora, which was relatively small, caused a year without summer, what would Toba have caused? If Krakatoa's ash caused global cooling from a moderate eruption, what would Toba's massive ash output have done? The scaling isn't linear. An eruption 10 times larger doesn't necessarily have effects 10 times worse, but it gives us a sense of magnitude. Toba was probably 50 times larger than Tambora. The volcanic winter it caused would have been proportionally more severe and longer lasting. If Tambora caused one bad year, Toba might have caused 10. If Krakatoa dropped global temperatures by 1 degree, Toba might have dropped them by 10 or 20. These numbers are rough estimates, but they convey the scale of what we're talking about. A catastrophe unlike anything in recorded human history. An event so severe that it nearly ended our species. Let's think about the survivors again, but this time from a different angle. What did they eat? How did they actually stay alive during the volcanic winter? Plant foods would have been scarce. Most plants die when temperatures drop too far or when sunlight is insufficient for photosynthesis. Some hardy species might have survived in protected areas. Root vegetables underground might have been edible even if the above-ground parts of the plant died. Grasses and sedges might have persisted in some areas. But overall, plant foods would have been unreliable. Animal foods would have been the main resource, but large animals would have been scarce too. Megafauna would have died off quickly without plant food. Smaller animals, rodents, birds, reptiles, might have been more available. They're easier to catch, and you don't need to hunt cooperatively to bring one down. Insects are another possibility. High in protein, abundant in many environments, and resilient to climate stress. Many modern hunter-gatherer societies include insects in their diet. The Toba survivors might have relied on them heavily. Marine resources would have been critical for coastal populations. Fish, shellfish, seaweed, these would have been the most reliable food sources during the volcanic winter. The ocean's ecosystem would have been affected, but not as severely as terrestrial ones. Shellfish in particular are resilient. They filter feed on plankton and detritus, and they're easy to collect. You don't need sophisticated tools or techniques. You just need to know where to look. The archaeological record supports this. Shell middens from the period right after Toba are found at several coastal sites in Africa. People were eating shellfish in large quantities, probably because it was one of the few food sources they could count on. Bone marrow would have been important too. When you're starving, you can't afford to waste any part of an animal. Even after the meat is gone, bones contain nutritious marrow and can be boiled to extract fats and proteins. Evidence of bone processing, bones that have been smashed open to access the marrow, appears more frequently in archaeological sites after Toba. Cannibalism is another grim possibility. When people are starving and all other food sources are exhausted, they sometimes turn to eating their own dead, or even killing the weak to feed the strong. It's horrible to think about, but it happens. It happened during famines in recorded history. It might have happened during Toba. We have no direct evidence of it, no bones showing butchery marks that suggest cannibalism from that time period. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. If it happened, people probably wouldn't have been proud of it. They wouldn't have created rituals around it or left clear archaeological signatures. They would have done what they had to do to survive and then tried to forget about it. The point is, survival during the volcanic winter would have required using every available resource, adopting strategies that might seem extreme or desperate by modern standards. The people who survived were the ones willing to do whatever it took. The ones who could adapt their diet, their behavior, their morality to fit the circumstances. And that willingness to do whatever it takes, that's still in us. When pushed to the edge, humans are capable of remarkable things. Some noble, some terrible, but all in service of survival. Let's talk about the children born during and after the volcanic winter. The ones who grew up in darkness, who never knew the world before. What was their childhood like? Imagine being born into a world where the sun is always dim, where your parents are stressed and scared, where food is always scarce, where people around you are dying. You wouldn't know anything different. To you, this would be normal. The darkness would be all you'd ever known. Your parents would tell you stories about the time before when the sky was bright and food was plentiful. But those stories would seem like fairy tales, like myths about a world that never really existed. You'd learn to survive in the darkness. You'd learn to find food in places others wouldn't think to look. You'd learn to move quietly, to conserve energy, to share with your group. You'd learn that survival is a group effort, that you can't make it alone. These lessons would shape you. They'd become part of who you are. And when you grew up and had children of your own, you'd pass those lessons on, not as abstract principles, but as concrete skills and behaviors. How to find water in the dry season. How to track animals when they're scarce. How to keep warm when it's cold. How to work with others even when you're hungry and tired and scared. Over generations, these survival skills would become culture. They'd become the traditions that define your people. And some of them would persist long after the volcanic winter ended, long after the world returned to normal. Because the children of the volcanic winter didn't forget. Even when things got better, even when the sun came back and food became plentiful again, they remembered. They remembered what it was like to be hungry. They remembered what it was like to be cold. They remembered what it was like to depend on others for survival. And they made sure their children remembered too. This is how trauma becomes culture. How a single catastrophic event can shape a society for thousands of years. The children of Toba's survivors grew up in a world defined by scarcity and fear. When they became adults, they created cultures that reflected those experiences. Cultures that emphasized preparation, conservation, sharing. Cultures that valued the group over the individual. Cultures that told stories about catastrophes and survivals, about the importance of being ready for the worst. And maybe, just maybe, some of those cultural values are still with us today. Maybe our modern emphasis on planning for the future, on building reserves, on creating safety nets, maybe that traces back to Toba. Maybe it's not just rational policy. Maybe it's cultural memory, a lesson learned 74,000 years ago and never forgotten. Now let's explore the spiritual and religious dimensions of surviving Toba. Because humans aren't just physical beings. We're meaning-making creatures. We need to understand why things happen, especially terrible things. The survivors of Toba would have asked why. Why did the sky go dark? Why did the world turn cold? Why did most people die while a few survived? In the absence of scientific explanations, they would have turned to spiritual ones. Maybe they believed the eruption was the anger of the gods. Maybe they thought they were being punished for some transgression. Maybe they created new rituals, new sacrifices, new prayers to appease the gods and prevent another catastrophe. Or maybe they lost faith in the old gods entirely. If the gods were supposed to protect them and the world ended anyway, what good were the gods? Maybe the survivors created new religions, new belief systems that made sense of what they'd experienced. We can't know for sure. Religion doesn't fossilize. It doesn't leave clear traces in the archaeological record. but we can make inferences based on what we know about human psychology and the role of religion in coping with trauma. Religion provides meaning. It helps people make sense of suffering. It gives them a framework for understanding why bad things happen and what they should do about it. The survivors of Toba would have needed that meaning desperately. Without it, the suffering would have been unbearable. With it, they could find purpose in their survival. They could believe they'd been spared for a reason, that they had a mission to rebuild, that their children would inherit a better world. Religion also provides community. It creates shared rituals and beliefs that bind people together. In the aftermath of catastrophe, that social cohesion would have been essential for survival. Groups that prayed together, that performed rituals together, that shared a common worldview, they would have been more unified, more cooperative, more resilient. So it's likely that the Toba survivors developed new religious practices or modified existing ones to address the catastrophe they'd experienced. And some of those practices might have evolved into the religions we know today. This is, again, speculative. We can't trace any specific modern religion back to Toba with certainty. But it's worth considering that some of our oldest religious ideas, the concepts of apocalypse, of divine punishment, of the world ending and being reborn, might have roots in real catastrophes like Toba. The idea of preparing for the end times, of building an ark or finding a refuge, appears in many religions. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, they all have eschatological traditions, beliefs about the end of the world. Where did these ideas come from? Maybe from cultural memories of times when the world did end or came close to it. Times like Toba. Let's talk about what the recovery would have looked like on a practical level. Because the volcanic winter didn't just end one day with the sun breaking through and everything returning to normal. Recovery would have been gradual, uneven, frustrating. First, the ash would have started to settle. After months or years in the stratosphere, the particles would have clumped together and fallen back to Earth. As they did, more sunlight would have gotten through. Temperatures would have started to rise, slowly at first, then more noticeably. The survivors would have felt the change, the air getting warmer, the darkness lifting, the first strong sunlight they'd seen in years breaking through the haze. It must have felt like a miracle. After so long in the cold and dark, the warmth and light would have been overwhelming. People might have wept with relief. They might have celebrated, created new festivals to mark the return of the sun. But the world wouldn't have immediately bounced back. The ash that fell to Earth covered everything in a thick, grey blanket. In some areas, it was feet deep. That ash had to be weathered, broken down, incorporated into the soil before plants could grow in it again. This process takes time. Years, maybe decades. Gradually, pioneer plants would have appeared. Hardy species that can grow in poor soils, that can tolerate harsh conditions. Grasses, mosses, ferns, weeds. They would have spread across the ash-covered landscapes, their roots breaking up the ash, their decomposing bodies adding organic matter to the soil. Over time, the soil would have improved. More plants could grow. Shrubs, then small trees, then larger trees. The forests would have started to return. But this is a process that takes generations. A landscape buried under volcanic ash doesn't recover in a few years. It takes centuries. The survivors would have seen the beginning of recovery, the first plants coming back, but they wouldn't have lived to see the forests fully restored. That would have been something their grandchildren or great-grandchildren witnessed. Animals would have followed the plants, herbivores returning to feed on the new growth, predators following the herbivores. Slowly, ecosystem by ecosystem, the web of life would have been rewoven. but it wouldn't have been the same as before. Some species had gone extinct. The niches they left empty would have been filled by other species, creating new ecological relationships, new balances. The world after Toba would have been different from the world before. Not better or worse necessarily, just different. Changed. Humans would have been part of that change. As the environment recovered, human populations would have grown. Groups that had huddled in refugia during the worst years would have started to expand, sending exploratory parties into newly habitable areas. Some of those parties would have found good resources and established new settlements. Others would have failed and died or returned to the refuge. But overall, the trend would have been expansion. More people, more territory, more innovation. The tools and technologies developed during the crisis would have been refined and improved. The cultural practices that helped people survive would have been formalized and transmitted more systematically. And gradually, over thousands of years, humans would have gone from barely surviving to thriving. From a few thousand individuals clinging to life in refugia to hundreds of thousands spread across multiple continents. From simple stone tools to complex technologies. From small bands to large societies. The recovery from Toba wasn't quick or easy, but it happened. And in happening, it set the stage for everything that came after. For the development of agriculture, for the rise of civilizations, for the modern world. Let's consider the long-term evolutionary effects of Toba. Because natural selection doesn't just operate on individuals, it operates on populations. And when a population goes through a severe bottleneck, the genetic composition of that population can change dramatically. Rare genetic variants that happen to be present in the survivors become common in the recovered population. Common variants that weren't present in the survivors disappear entirely. This is called genetic drift, and it can have profound effects on the evolution of a species. For humans, the Toba bottleneck would have been a powerful driver of genetic drift. Whatever alleles or gene variants the survivors carried would have become the foundation of all future human genetic diversity. Traits that might have been rare before Toba could have become widespread after it, not because they provided any advantage, but just because they happened to be present in the survivors. On the flip side, traits that might have been common before Toba could have disappeared if they weren't present in the surviving population. This process would have reshaped human genetic diversity in ways that are still visible today. Our immune systems, for instance, show evidence of past bottlenecks. We have less diversity in immune genes than we do in some other parts of the genome. This makes us more vulnerable to pandemics because a pathogen that can evade one person's immune system might be able to evade everyone's. But it also might reflect the particular immune challenges that the Toba survivors faced. Maybe the survivors were the ones who had immune systems that could handle the diseases circulating during the volcanic winter. Their immune genes, whatever they were, became the template for all future human immune systems. Similarly, our genes related to cold tolerance, to diet, to stress response, all of these might bear the imprint of Toba. The survivors were the ones who could tolerate cold, who could survive on a limited diet, who could function under extreme stress. Their genes became our genes. There's also the possibility of what's called a selective sweep, where a beneficial mutation that appeared in the survivors spread rapidly through the recovering population because it provided such a strong advantage. Some geneticists think this might explain certain features of modern humans, our large brains, for instance. Brain size in humans increased significantly in the last 100,000 years. Could that increase have been accelerated by selection during or after Toba? If having a larger brain and thus greater cognitive ability was the difference between surviving and dying during the volcanic winter, then genes for larger brains would have been strongly favored. Over generations, this could have driven an increase in average brain size in the population. This is speculative, and there's debate about it. But it's an example of how a catastrophe like Toba could have influenced human evolution in unexpected ways. Not just by killing most of the population, but by changing the genetic composition of the survivors in ways that shaped the future trajectory of our species. Now let's talk about the possibility that Toba wasn't the only catastrophe our ancestors faced, because volcanic eruptions happen regularly on geological timescales. Toba was the biggest in the last 2 million years, but it wasn't the only one. There were other supervolcanic eruptions before Toba, and there will be others in the future. About 640,000 years ago, the Yellowstone supervolcano erupted. That's before modern humans evolved, but our hominin ancestors were around. The eruption would have affected them. How much, we don't know. We don't have the same detailed genetic and archaeological evidence for that time period. But it's likely that it caused population crashes and bottlenecks in whatever hominin species were alive then. About 75,000 years before Toba, there was another large eruption in Sumatra, at Mount Toba's precursor system. This eruption was smaller than the main Toba event, but still significant. It might have caused its own volcanic winter, its own crisis for early humans. Are we the survivors of multiple catastrophes? Is our species defined not by one near-extinction event, but by a series of them, each one winnowing down the population, each one selecting for the most adaptable, the most resilient? It's possible. The genetic evidence shows not just one bottleneck, but potentially several, at different times in our history. Each bottleneck would have been a crisis. Each one would have tested our ancestors. And each one they survived made us a little bit tougher, a little bit better equipped to handle the next one. This idea of serial catastrophes shaping human evolution is sobering. It suggests that we're not the product of a smooth, gradual evolutionary process. We're the product of repeated brushes with extinction. We exist because our ancestors survived things that should have killed them, multiple times. And that survival, that stubborn refusal to go extinct, that's in our DNA. It's who we are. Let's explore the idea of human resilience in more depth because it's really the core of the Toba story. Resilience isn't just about being tough or strong. It's about being flexible, adaptable, creative in the face of challenges. It's about finding new solutions when old ones don't work. It's about working together because you can't survive alone. The humans who survived Toba had all these qualities. They weren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest or the smartest in some abstract sense. They were the ones who could adapt to new conditions, who could change their diet when their traditional foods disappeared, who could develop new technologies when old ones weren't sufficient, who could cooperate with others even under stress. Resilience is also about psychological flexibility, about being able to tolerate uncertainty, to live with fear and not be paralyzed by it. The Toba survivors lived with tremendous uncertainty. They didn't know if the sun would come back. They didn't know if they would survive another day. But they kept going anyway. They found ways to cope with the psychological stress, to maintain hope, to find meaning in suffering. How did they do that? We can't ask them. But we can look at modern examples of people surviving catastrophes. Holocaust survivors. Survivors of famines, wars, genocides. Refugees who flee violence and rebuild their lives in new countries. What these survivors have in common is resilience. They don't all have the same strategies. Some turn to religion or spirituality. Some focus on practical tasks, on doing what needs to be done. Some find strength in community, in helping others. Some use humor to cope. Some tell stories, preserving their experiences for future generations. The Toba survivors probably used all these strategies and more. They created rituals to give structure to their days. They told stories to make sense of what was happening. They helped each other because they knew their survival depended on it. They found moments of joy, small pleasures in the midst of horror. A warm fire, a successful hunt, a child's laugh. These moments wouldn't have erased the suffering, but they would have made it bearable. They would have reminded the survivors why they were fighting to live. Because life, even in the worst circumstances, has moments worth living for. This is what resilience really means. Not the absence of suffering, but the ability to find meaning and purpose and even joy in the midst of suffering. The Toba survivors had this ability. They passed it on to their children, and their children passed it on to us. When you face your own challenges, your own moments of darkness, remember that you come from a long line of survivors. People who faced worse than you can probably imagine and kept going. That same resilience is in you. You might not know it's there until you need it. But it is. Waiting. Ready. Let's talk about what Toba means for our future. Because the past informs the present, and both inform the future. We know that supervolcanic eruptions can happen. We know they can cause global catastrophes. We know our species can survive them, but barely. What should we be doing to prepare for the next one? First, we should be monitoring volcanic systems carefully. We are doing this to some extent. The USGS monitors Yellowstone. Other organizations monitor Toba, Campiflagre, and other potential supervolcanoes. But we could be doing more. More seismometers, more GPS stations, more gas sampling, more computer modeling. The more we know about how these systems behave, the better we can predict when an eruption might be coming. Second, we should be developing response plans. What would we actually do if Yellowstone started showing signs of an imminent eruption? Who would be evacuated? Where would they go? How would we feed them? These are complex logistical questions that require planning and coordination across multiple government agencies and levels of government. We should be working on these plans now, before the crisis, not scrambling to figure it out when the mountain starts smoking. Third, we should be investing in technologies that could help us survive a volcanic winter. This might sound like science fiction, but it's not. We could develop cold-resistant crops that could grow with reduced sunlight. We could build large-scale greenhouse systems that could produce food, even in a cold, dark environment. We could research alternative protein sources like insect farming or lab-grown meat that don't depend on traditional agriculture. Some of this research is already happening for other reasons: climate change, food security, space exploration. But we should be explicitly considering the volcanic winter scenario and funding research that would help us survive it. Fourth, we should be building up strategic reserves: food, medicine, fuel, essential supplies. Most countries keep some reserves, but they're usually only enough for a few months. A volcanic winter could last years. We should have reserves sufficient for that. This would be expensive. It would require significant investment and ongoing maintenance, but it would be insurance against a low-probability, high-impact event. And unlike some forms of insurance, food reserves have other uses. They can be rotated out and used for disaster relief, for feeding refugees, for stabilizing food prices during shortages. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we should be fostering international cooperation. A supervolcanic eruption wouldn't respect national borders. It would be a global crisis requiring a global response. Countries would need to share resources, coordinate evacuations, support each other through the recovery. We have some frameworks for this already. International disaster relief organizations, UN agencies, bilateral agreements. But we need to strengthen these frameworks and make sure they could function under the extreme stress of a volcanic winter. This all sounds very pragmatic and policy-oriented. But there's a deeper lesson here too. The lesson is that we need to take long-term, low-probability risks seriously. We're bad at this as a species. We focus on immediate threats, on problems we can see and touch. We have trouble planning for events that might not happen in our lifetimes. But those events, when they do happen, can be civilization-ending. We need to get better at thinking long-term, at investing in preparation even when the payoff might be decades or centuries away, at maintaining vigilance even when everything seems fine, because that's what the Toba survivors did in their own way. They remembered the catastrophe. They passed down stories and strategies. They prepared their children for the possibility that it could happen again. And in doing so, they gave us the tools to survive future catastrophes. We should honor that legacy by being just as vigilant, just as prepared. Let's shift gears and think about Toba in the context of other existential risks humanity faces. Because volcanic eruptions aren't the only thing that could threaten our species. Asteroid impacts are another natural threat. An asteroid large enough could cause damage comparable to a supervolcanic eruption. Widespread destruction, climate change, potential mass extinction. We're actually doing a decent job of monitoring for asteroids. NASA and other organizations track near-Earth objects and model potential impacts. If we detected a large asteroid on a collision course with Earth, we'd have years or decades of warning, potentially enough time to develop a deflection strategy. But there are other risks too. Pandemics. We just lived through COVID-19, which was scary but not existential. But a more lethal pathogen, something with the transmissibility of COVID and the fatality rate of Ebola, could kill hundreds of millions or even billions of people. Our modern global transportation networks would spread it faster than any pandemic in history. Nuclear war is another risk. We have enough nuclear weapons to cause a nuclear winter similar to a volcanic winter. The ash and soot from burning cities would block out the sun. Temperatures would drop. Agriculture would fail. Billions would starve. Climate change, if left unchecked, could make large parts of the world uninhabitable. Sea level rise, extreme weather, ecosystem collapse. These effects would unfold over decades or centuries rather than months, but the end result could be catastrophic. Artificial intelligence, as it becomes more capable, could pose risks we're only beginning to understand. If we develop AI systems that are more intelligent than humans and don't align them with human values, they could act in ways that are harmful to us. And finally, there's the risk of ecological collapse. We're driving species to extinction at an unprecedented rate. We're disrupting ecosystems globally. At some point, we might push these systems past a tipping point where they collapse entirely, taking with them the ecosystem services we depend on. Clean air, clean water, pollination, climate regulation. These risks are diverse, but they have something in common. They're all potentially existential. They could threaten the survival of human civilization or even our species. And the lesson from Toba is that we can survive existential threats, but not easily, and not without tremendous loss. The Toba survivors lost most of their population. They lost their way of life. They lost knowledge, culture, people they loved. They survived, but at a terrible cost. We should be working to prevent these risks from materializing in the first place. Monitoring asteroids and developing deflection capabilities, controlling nuclear arsenals, and reducing the risk of war. Addressing climate change before it becomes catastrophic. Developing AI safely. Preserving biodiversity and ecosystems. But we should also be preparing for the possibility that despite our best efforts, one of these catastrophes will happen. Having plans, having reserves, having resilient systems that can function even when global systems break down. The Toba survivors didn't have any of these advantages. They had stone tools and their wits. They survived anyway. We have so much more we should be able to do better. We should be able to not just survive catastrophe, but recover from it quickly, rebuild stronger, learn from the experience. That should be our goal, not just survival, but resilient, adaptive survival that honors the legacy of those who came before us. Now, let's take a moment to think about what the world would look like if Toba hadn't happened, if the volcano had never erupted, or if it had erupted less violently, or if the volcanic winter had been milder. How different would history have been? Without the population bottleneck, human genetic diversity would be higher. We'd have more variation in our genes, potentially including alleles that are now lost forever. That greater diversity might have made us more resilient to some diseases, but more vulnerable to others. Without the selective pressure of the volcanic winter, our cognitive evolution might have taken a different path. Maybe we would have developed behavioral modernity more slowly, or not at all. Maybe we'd still be in the Middle Stone Age, using simple tools, living in small bands, not that different from our ancestors of 200,000 years ago. Or maybe we would have evolved in entirely different directions. Maybe without Toba, other human species would have survived. Neanderthals, Denisovans, maybe others we don't know about. The world would be shared by multiple human species, each with their own cultures and technologies. How would that have changed history? Would we have coexisted peacefully? Would we have competed for resources? Would we have interbred more extensively, creating hybrid populations? It's impossible to say, but it's fascinating to speculate. The point is, Toba was a pivotal event, a hinge point in human history. The world before Toba was one thing. The world after Toba was something else. We're living in the after Toba world. Everything about modern humanity, our genetics, our psychology, our culture, has been shaped by that event and its aftermath. Even 74,000 years later, we're still feeling its effects. And that's both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reminds us how contingent our existence is. We're here because of a combination of luck and adaptability. If things had gone slightly differently, we might not be. Empowering because it shows what we're capable of. Our ancestors survived the worst catastrophe in human history. They rebuilt, they thrived. We're the proof of their success. And if we ever face a similar catastrophe, we have their example to guide us. Let's talk about one more aspect of the Toba story, the role of storytelling. Because humans are storytelling animals. We make sense of the world through narrative. We teach through stories. We remember through stories. We find meaning through stories. The Toba survivors would have told stories about the day the sky went dark, about the years of cold and hunger, about the people they lost, about the struggles they endured, about the moments of hope and kindness that kept them going. These stories would have served multiple purposes. They would have been a way to process trauma, to give it shape and meaning. They would have been a way to pass on knowledge, to teach the next generation how to survive. They would have been a way to build community, to create shared identity and purpose. And they would have been a way to remember, to make sure that those who died weren't forgotten, that their suffering mattered, that the lessons learned in blood and tears weren't lost. Some of these stories might have survived, transformed and mythologized into the ancient myths and legends we have today. Others were lost when the last person who remembered them died, but the practice of storytelling survived, and it's still with us. We still tell stories to make sense of disaster. We still use narrative to teach and remember. We still find meaning through story. This essay, in a way, is a continuation of that tradition. I'm telling you the story of Toba, trying to make sense of it, trying to draw lessons from it, trying to honor the memory of those who survived. And maybe in reading or listening to this story, you're part of that tradition too. You're taking in the story. You're thinking about what it means. You're connecting it to your own life and experiences. That's what stories do. They create connections across time and space. They link us to our ancestors and to each other. The Toba survivors are long gone. Their names are lost. Their individual experiences are unknowable. But their story survives in the DNA we carry, in the cultures we've built, in the myths we tell, and in essays like this one. They speak to us across 74,000 years. And if we listen, we can hear them, telling us to be ready, to prepare, to work together, to never give up, to find meaning even in darkness, to remember. That's the final lesson of Toba. Not about volcanoes or climate or genetics, about the power of story to connect us across time, to teach us, to inspire us, to remind us who we are and where we came from. We're the children of the Toba survivors. We carry their stories in our bones. And now, let's explore something that might seem strange at first. The idea that Toba might have actually been good for humanity in the long run. Not good in the sense that it wasn't horrible. It was. Not good in the sense that people didn't suffer. They did, terribly. But good in the sense that it forced evolutionary and cultural changes that ultimately made us stronger, more capable, more resilient. This is a controversial idea. It sounds almost callous to suggest that a catastrophe that killed 99% of humanity could have positive effects. But evolution doesn't have moral preferences. It doesn't care about individual suffering. It only cares about what survives and reproduces. And from that cold, evolutionary perspective, Toba was a powerful selective force that shaped modern humanity. Think about it this way. Before Toba, humans were one of many species of megafauna in Africa and Asia. We were successful, certainly, but we weren't dominant. We shared the landscape with other large predators, with other hominin species, with megaherbivores that could outcompete us for resources. We had our niche, but it was a limited one. After Toba, the landscape was different. Many of our competitors were gone, either extinct or reduced to tiny populations. The ecological niches they'd occupied were empty. And humans, with our newfound behavioral modernity, our enhanced cognitive abilities, our improved cooperation, we were perfectly positioned to fill those niches. We spread rapidly, adapting to environments we'd never inhabited before. Within 20,000 years of Toba, we were on every continent except Antarctica. We'd become the dominant large mammal on the planet. Would that have happened without Toba? Maybe eventually. But Toba accelerated the process. It created conditions that favored the traits that would make us successful: intelligence, cooperation, adaptability, and it removed the competitors that might have prevented our expansion. There's a concept in evolutionary biology called creative destruction. The idea that catastrophes, while devastating in the short term, can create opportunities in the long term. They clear away the old, the established, the dominant, and create space for new forms to emerge and experiment and thrive. Toba was creative destruction on a planetary scale. It destroyed the old world, the world of multiple human species and stable ecosystems and predictable climate. And in that destruction, it created space for something new. For us, for modern humans with our big brains and our symbolic thought and our capacity to reshape the planet. Does this justify the suffering? Of course not. The individuals who died in the volcanic winter, the parents who watched their children starve, the children who grew up in darkness and fear, their suffering was real and terrible and should not be minimized. But we can acknowledge the suffering while also recognizing that out of it came something remarkable. A species with the capacity to understand the universe, to create art and music and literature, to cure diseases, to explore other planets. We wouldn't exist without Toba, not as we are now. The catastrophe shaped us in fundamental ways, and while the price was terrible, the result, humanity as we know it, that's something extraordinary. This is the paradox of catastrophe. It destroys, but it also creates. It ends one story, but begins another. The story that began after Toba is our story. The story of humanity's rise from the edge of extinction to dominance of the planet. And that story is still being written. Let's think about what the next chapter might hold, because we're not done evolving. We're not done adapting. We're not done facing catastrophes. The world is changing faster now than ever before. Climate is shifting. Technology is advancing. Our population is growing. Resources are being strained. We're facing challenges that our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Challenges that will test us in new ways. But we have advantages they didn't have. We have science. We understand the natural world in ways that would seem like magic to the Toba survivors. We can predict volcanic eruptions, track asteroids, model climate change. We're not helpless before nature anymore. We have technology. We can build structures that withstand earthquakes, develop vaccines against diseases, generate power from the sun and wind. We can feed billions of people, connect across vast distances, store and transmit knowledge instantaneously. We have institutions, governments, international organizations, systems of law and cooperation that span the globe. We can coordinate responses to threats on a planetary scale, but we also have vulnerabilities. Our systems are complex and interconnected. A failure in one part can cascade through the whole system. Our technology is powerful but can be misused. Our institutions are robust but can be corrupted or paralyzed. Our knowledge is vast but incomplete. We don't know everything. We can't predict everything. We make mistakes. The question is whether our advantages outweigh our vulnerabilities, whether we can use our science, our technology, our institutions to navigate the challenges ahead, whether we can avoid the catastrophes that threaten us, or at least minimize their impact. I think we can, because we're the descendants of the Toba survivors. We have their resilience in our genes. We have their adaptability in our culture. We have their stubborn refusal to give up in our psychology. When faced with catastrophe, humans don't just lay down and die. We innovate, we cooperate, we find ways through. That's what the Toba survivors did 74,000 years ago. That's what we'll do when our time comes. But we need to prepare. We need to be proactive. We can't wait for the catastrophe to hit and then scramble to respond. We need to be building resilient systems now, developing technologies now, fostering cooperation now, learning from the past so we don't repeat its mistakes. The Toba survivors didn't have the luxury of preparation. The eruption came without warning. They had to adapt on the fly with whatever resources they had. We don't have that excuse. We know catastrophes can happen. We can see them coming, at least some of them. We have the ability to prepare. We just need the will. And that's where the story of Toba becomes not just history, but inspiration. When you feel overwhelmed by the challenges of the modern world, when you wonder if we can really solve climate change or prevent nuclear war or survive the next pandemic, remember Toba. Remember that our ancestors faced worse with less and survived. If they could do it, so can we. We just need to believe it and act accordingly. Now let's dive into some of the cutting-edge research that's still being done on Toba. Because this isn't a closed case. Scientists are still studying the eruption, still debating its effects, still discovering new evidence that shapes our understanding. One area of active research is improving the dating of the eruption. We know Toba erupted about 74,000 years ago, but the exact date is still uncertain. Different dating methods give slightly different results. Some put it at 73,000 years ago, others at 75,000. This might not seem like a big difference, but when you're trying to correlate the eruption with genetic bottlenecks or archaeological changes, a few thousand years matters. Scientists are using new techniques: argon-argon dating, improved radiocarbon dating, analyzing ice cores with better precision to narrow down the date. The goal is to get it to within a few hundred years, which would allow much more precise correlations with other events. Another area of research is climate modeling. How bad was the volcanic winter really? The early models suggested severe global cooling, temperatures dropping by 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, lasting for a decade or more. But those models were relatively simple. They made assumptions about atmospheric circulation, about how aerosols would spread, about feedback effects in the climate system. Newer models, run on more powerful computers with more sophisticated algorithms, sometimes give different results. Some suggest the cooling was less severe than originally thought. Others suggest it was more severe but shorter-lived. Still others suggest the effects varied dramatically by region, with some areas barely affected and others experiencing catastrophic cooling. The debate continues, and as our models improve, we'll get closer to understanding what really happened. There's also research into the archaeological evidence, looking for more sites that preserve information about the period around Toba. The problem is that sites from 74,000 years ago are rare, especially in the areas closest to the volcano, which were buried under meters of ash. But archaeologists keep looking, keep excavating, keep finding new evidence. Sometimes they find sites that show continuity through Toba, suggesting people survived in that area. Sometimes they find sites that show disruption, suggesting population collapse. Each new site adds a piece to the puzzle, helping us understand the geographic variability of the impact. Genetic research is also ongoing. As DNA sequencing becomes cheaper and more powerful, scientists can analyze genomes from more people, from more diverse populations, with greater precision. This is revealing fine-scale patterns in human genetic diversity that can tell us about ancient population structure, migration routes, bottlenecks. Some recent studies have questioned the severity of the Toba bottleneck, suggesting it might have been less extreme than originally thought. Others have confirmed it, but with nuance, showing that different populations experience different levels of impact. The truth is probably complex. There wasn't a single bottleneck affecting all humans equally. There were multiple bottlenecks in different populations at different times, with Toba being one factor among many. Understanding this complexity is an ongoing research challenge. Scientists are also studying other species to understand how they were affected by Toba. Genetic studies of great apes, of various mammals, of birds, all provide data about population changes around 74,000 years ago. These studies help us understand whether the impact was really global and severe or more localized and variable. There's even research into the volcano itself. Scientists drill cores into the lakebed at Toba, extracting sediments that record the history of the volcano over millions of years. They analyze the rock to understand the chemistry of the magma, the timeline of past eruptions, the potential for future ones. This research isn't just academic. It has practical implications. If we understand how Toba works, we can better predict when it might erupt again. We can develop early warning systems. We can plan evacuations and responses. The more we know, the better prepared we'll be. All of this research adds up to a deeper, richer understanding of the Toba catastrophe. It's not a simple story of a volcano erupting and almost ending humanity. It's a complex story of geological forces, climate systems, biological responses, and human resilience. A story that we're still uncovering piece by piece. Let's talk about some of the other supervolcanic eruptions in Earth's history, because Toba wasn't the biggest or the worst. It was just the biggest in recent history. Recent meaning the last couple million years. Go back further and you find eruptions that make Toba look small. About 2 million years ago, the Yellowstone supervolcano erupted with a force about 10 times larger than Toba. It ejected more than 600 cubic miles of material, compared to Toba's 670. Wait, that's about the same. Let me recalculate. Actually, some estimates put the Huckleberry Ridge eruption at Yellowstone at about 600 cubic miles, slightly less than Toba. But other estimates go higher, up to 1,000 cubic miles. The uncertainty reflects how hard it is to measure these ancient eruptions. The point is, Yellowstone has erupted at supervolcanic scales multiple times. The Huckleberry Ridge eruption 2 million years ago. The Mesa Falls eruption 1.3 million years ago. The Lava Creek eruption 640,000 years ago. Each of these would have caused global climate effects, though we don't have as much evidence about the specific impacts because they happened so long ago. Go back even further and you find truly massive eruptions. The La Garita eruption in Colorado about 28 million years ago might have ejected over 1,200 cubic miles of material. Nearly twice what Toba produced. It's the largest known explosive eruption in Earth's history. What were the effects? We don't really know. It happened long before humans existed, but it would have been catastrophic for whatever species were around at the time. Mammals, birds, reptiles, all would have been affected. The Toba event gives us a template for understanding these ancient eruptions. If Toba nearly wiped out humans, what did La Garita do to the mammals of the Oligocene? We can make educated guesses. Mass die-offs, population bottlenecks, ecological disruption lasting for years or decades. But the specifics are lost to time. The important point is that supervolcanic eruptions are a recurring feature of Earth's history. They happen regularly on geological timescales. Every few 100,000 years, somewhere on the planet, a supervolcano erupts and reshapes the world. Life adapts. Species go extinct. New species emerge. The planet carries on. Humans haven't been around long enough to experience many of these eruptions. Toba is the only definite one in our species' history. But there will be more. And when they come, we'll have to adapt, just like our ancestors did. Hopefully, with better tools and better preparation. Now let's explore what life might have been like in the immediate aftermath of the Toba eruption, in the first days and weeks. Because the long-term effects, the years of volcanic winter, those are abstract. But the immediate impact, that's visceral. Imagine you're living in East Africa, thousands of miles from Toba. You wouldn't have felt the eruption itself. The ground might have trembled slightly, but you wouldn't have known what it meant. The first sign would have been the sky. Over the course of a few days, the sunsets would have become more vivid. Brilliant reds and oranges caused by ash particles in the upper atmosphere scattering light. People might have found it beautiful, an omen perhaps, but not necessarily a bad one. Then the ash would have started to fall, just a light dusting at first. Fine grey powder settling on leaves, on the ground, on your skin. It would have seemed strange but not immediately threatening. You might have wondered what it was. Dust from a distant storm, pollen from some unknown plant, but the ash would have kept falling, day after day, getting thicker, starting to accumulate. Within a week or two, there might have been an inch of ash covering everything. Within a month, several inches. Plants would have started to die, smothered under the ash. Animals would have become agitated, their food sources disappearing, and the sky would have grown darker. The sun, once bright, would have dimmed to a pale disk visible through the haze. Daytime would have felt like twilight. People would have been confused, frightened. What was happening? Why wouldn't it stop? Some might have tried to brush the ash away, to clear it from their shelters, their food stores. But it was futile. More would just keep falling. Others might have fled, looking for areas where the ash wasn't as thick. But there were no such areas. The ash was everywhere, carried by winds across the entire globe. And then the temperature would have started to drop, nights getting colder, days not warming up as much as they should. Within weeks or months, it would have been noticeably colder than normal. Frost in the mornings, ice on water. People would have struggled to stay warm. They'd have burned more firewood, worn more clothing, huddled closer together at night. But the cold would have been relentless, and the food situation would have gotten worse. Plants dead or dying, animals starving or fled, the easy food sources gone. People would have had to work harder to find enough to eat. They'd have had to range farther, take more risks. Competition for scarce resources would have intensified. Maybe there were conflicts. Maybe people banded together. Probably both, depending on the group. Some would have cooperated, sharing what little they had, working together to survive. Others would have fought, taking from weaker groups, hoarding resources. This is the reality of catastrophe. It brings out both the best and the worst in people. The immediate aftermath of Toba would have been chaos, confusion, fear, desperation. People trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to survive day by day, watching their world change in ways they couldn't understand or control. And this chaos would have lasted not for days or weeks, but for months, maybe years. The ash falling, the sun hidden, the temperatures dropping, the food disappearing. No end in sight. Can you imagine living through that? The psychological toll would have been immense, but people endured. They had to. There was no choice. You either found a way to survive, or you died. And the ones who survived, they were our ancestors. They were the ones who kept going even when everything seemed hopeless. Their endurance is why we're here. Let's talk about the role of fire during the volcanic winter. Fire would have been absolutely critical for survival. Not just for warmth, though, that was important, but for cooking, for light, for protection, for social cohesion. Humans had been using fire for hundreds of thousands of years by the time of Toba. We knew how to make it, how to maintain it, how to use it. But during the volcanic winter, fire would have taken on new importance. With temperatures dropping, staying warm would have been essential. Hypothermia kills quickly. People would have needed fires going constantly, day and night. That means collecting fuel, lots of it. Wood, dried grass, animal dung, anything that burns. In a world where plants were dying, fuel would have become scarce. People would have had to travel farther to find it. They might have had to make hard choices about where to allocate resources. Do you burn wood to stay warm, or save it for cooking? Fire also provided light. With the sun dimmed, the world would have been darker than normal. Fires would have been the main source of light for work, for social activities, for simple comfort. Imagine living in near constant twilight. The psychological impact would have been profound. Fires would have been islands of brightness in a dark world, gathering places where people could see each other's faces, feel connected. Cooking with fire would have been important too. Raw food is harder to digest and provides less nutrition than cooked food. In a time when food was scarce, every calorie mattered. Cooking would have helped people extract maximum nutrition from whatever they could find. Fire also provided protection. Predators are wary of fire. In a world where resources were scarce and predators might have been desperate, keeping a fire burning would have deterred attacks. And fire was a social focal point. People gather around fires. They talk, tell stories, make plans. Fire creates community. During the volcanic winter, that social cohesion would have been essential. Groups that stayed together, that supported each other, would have been more likely to survive than individuals or fractured groups. So fire wasn't just a tool. It was the center of human survival strategy during Toba. Without it, survival would have been nearly impossible. With it, people had a fighting chance. Let's consider the psychological concept of post-traumatic growth. It's the idea that trauma, while harmful, can also lead to positive changes. People who survive terrible experiences sometimes emerge stronger, more resilient, with a greater appreciation for life. Could this have happened with the Toba survivors? Did the catastrophe, horrific as it was, lead to growth in human capabilities and culture? There's evidence that it might have. As we've discussed, the period after Toba saw an explosion of behavioral modernity. Art, sophisticated tools, long-distance trade, ritual burial. These are all signs of a more complex, more capable species. Was this growth a result of the trauma? Maybe. Trauma forces you to confront fundamental questions about meaning, about purpose, about what matters. The Toba survivors would have been forced to think deeply about these questions. And in answering them, they might have developed new ways of thinking, new cultural practices, new technologies. Trauma also forces innovation. When your old ways of doing things don't work anymore, you have to invent new ways. The Toba survivors couldn't rely on traditional food sources or hunting methods. They had to innovate, and those innovations, tested in the crucible of catastrophe, would have been refined and passed on. Trauma can also strengthen social bonds. When you go through hell with a group of people, you form bonds that are deeper than ordinary friendships. You trust each other because you've depended on each other for survival. The Toba survivors would have formed these kinds of bonds, and those bonds would have created more cohesive, more cooperative groups that were better at working together to solve problems. So yes, the Toba catastrophe was traumatic. It caused immense suffering. But out of that suffering came growth. Not immediately, not easily, but over generations. The descendants of the survivors were different from the people who came before, changed by the experience, shaped by it, made stronger in some ways, though at a terrible cost. Let's think about the concept of evolutionary bottlenecks in a broader context. Because Toba wasn't unique in causing a bottleneck. Many species have gone through them. And understanding how bottlenecks work can tell us about Toba and about evolution in general. A bottleneck happens when a population crashes to a small size and then recovers. The small population acts as a filter. Only the individuals who happen to survive get to pass on their genes. This means genetic diversity is lost. Alleles that were present in the larger population but absent in the survivors are gone forever. But bottlenecks can also have positive effects, evolutionarily speaking. They can purge harmful mutations. If individuals carrying deleterious genes happen to die during the bottleneck, those genes are removed from the population. The recovered population is genetically healthier. Bottlenecks can also facilitate rapid evolution. With reduced diversity, new beneficial mutations can spread quickly through the population. There's less genetic inertia resisting change. Many species show evidence of past bottlenecks. Cheetahs went through a severe bottleneck about 12,000 years ago. Today, all cheetahs are so genetically similar that they're almost clones. They can even accept skin grafts from unrelated individuals without rejection. The elephant seal population crashed to about 20 individuals in the 1890s due to hunting. They've recovered to hundreds of thousands, but they have very low genetic diversity. Northern elephant seals are all descended from that tiny survivor population. Humans show signs of a bottleneck around the time of Toba, but we also show signs of recovery. Our population rebounded. Our diversity, while lower than it could have been, is still significant compared to species like cheetahs or elephant seals. The Toba bottleneck shaped us but didn't cripple us. We recovered and thrived. And that's the important lesson. Bottlenecks are challenges, but they're not death sentences. Species can come through them and emerge viable, even stronger in some ways. Now let's explore the idea of cultural bottlenecks alongside genetic ones. Because when a population crashes, you don't just lose genetic diversity. You lose cultural diversity too. Knowledge, skills, traditions, these are passed down through teaching and learning. If the people who carry that knowledge die, the knowledge dies with them. During Toba, much cultural knowledge would have been lost. Specialized skills that only a few people had. Stories that only certain elders knew. Techniques for making particular tools or exploiting particular resources. When those individuals died, their knowledge died with them. This is a tragedy from a cultural perspective. It's also a setback for survival. The more knowledge you have, the more options you have for dealing with challenges. Loss of knowledge reduces your options. But there's a flip side. Cultural bottlenecks can also lead to innovation. When old knowledge is lost, people have to invent new solutions. And sometimes those new solutions are better than the old ones. The stone tools that appear after Toba, for instance, might not have been developments of earlier tools. They might have been completely new inventions, created by people who didn't know how their ancestors had done things, and so had to figure it out from scratch. Innovation out of necessity. Cultural evolution, like genetic evolution, can be accelerated by bottlenecks. The pressure to survive forces experimentation, and the reduced population size means successful experiments can spread quickly. Everyone needs new tools. The person who invents a better design becomes influential. Their technique gets copied. Within a generation or two, everyone's using the new method. This is cultural evolution in action, and it can happen much faster than genetic evolution. The Toba survivors would have experienced both genetic and cultural bottlenecks. Both would have shaped the future trajectory of humanity. We are who we are genetically and culturally because of what happened during and after Toba. Let's talk about one more aspect of the Toba story that often gets overlooked: the role of women. Because in most discussions of prehistoric survival, the focus is on hunting, tool-making, warfare, activities traditionally associated with men. But women would have been just as critical to survival during Toba, maybe more so. Women are the ones who bear and nurse children. During a population bottleneck, every child matters. The survival of the species depends on women being able to have healthy children and keep them alive. During the volcanic winter, this would have been extraordinarily challenging. Malnutrition affects fertility. Stressed women are less likely to conceive and more likely to miscarry. When they do give birth, malnourished mothers produce less milk. Infants starve. The infant mortality rate during Toba would have been horrific. Most babies born during the worst years probably didn't survive. The women who did manage to have healthy children, who kept them alive through the catastrophe, they were the ones who ensured humanity's survival. Their genes are the ones we carry. Women were also critical for gathering food. In most hunter-gatherer societies, women provide the majority of calories through gathering plant foods. During Toba, with plant foods scarce, women would have had to work harder to find edible roots, tubers, seeds. They would have had to innovate, trying new food sources, developing new gathering techniques. Women were the ones who processed food, who turned raw materials into edible meals, who preserved food for lean times, who allocated resources within the group. These are unglamorous roles, but absolutely essential for survival. Women were also the primary caregivers for children, which meant they were the primary teachers. They passed on knowledge, skills, cultural practices. During a cultural bottleneck, when much knowledge is being lost, the knowledge that women choose to pass on becomes the foundation of future culture. And women were community builders. They maintained social bonds, mediated conflicts, cared for the sick and elderly. In times of stress, when groups could easily fracture, these roles would have been critical for keeping people together. So when we talk about the Toba survivors, we should remember that we're talking as much about women as men, maybe more. Because while men might have been doing the hunting and the fighting, women were doing the essential work of keeping people alive and raising the next generation. We're all descended from women who survived Toba, who kept their children alive when almost everyone was dying, who passed on their knowledge and their resilience, who rebuilt the human population from almost nothing. That's something to remember and honor. Now let's bring all of this together and think about what the Toba story really means for us today. At its core, it's a story about survival against overwhelming odds, about human resilience in the face of catastrophe, about adaptation, innovation, and cooperation. But it's also a story about fragility, about how close we came to extinction, about how a single event, beyond human control, nearly ended our species. Both lessons are important. The resilience lesson tells us that we can survive almost anything if we're prepared and determined, that humans are tougher than we often realize, that we have resources, both genetic and cultural, that we don't even know about until we're tested. The fragility lesson tells us that we shouldn't be complacent, that the world can change in an instant, that catastrophes happen, that we need to be prepared, vigilant, humble before the forces that shape our planet. Living with both lessons, the resilience and the fragility, that's the wisdom of Toba. It's about being confident in our abilities while being realistic about our vulnerabilities, about preparing for disaster while living fully in the present, about learning from the past while building for the future. The Toba survivors didn't have the luxury of these reflections. They were too busy trying to survive. But we do. We can look back across 74,000 years and see their struggle and draw lessons from it. We can honor their memory by being the best version of humanity we can be. By using our science and our technology not just for comfort and convenience, but for preparation and resilience. By building systems that can withstand shocks, by cooperating across borders and cultures, by thinking long-term, by refusing to give up even when things seem hopeless. That's the legacy of Toba. Not just the genetic bottleneck or the behavioral changes or the archaeological evidence, but the lesson that humans can endure, that we can survive, that we can build something meaningful even on the ashes of catastrophe. That's what the survivors did 74,000 years ago. That's what we can do in whatever catastrophes lie ahead. And with that, we come to the end of this extended exploration of the Toba catastrophe. From the eruption itself to its effects on climate, genetics, evolution, culture, and psychology. From the immediate aftermath to the long-term recovery. From the scientific debates to the speculative implications. We've covered a lot of ground, but the story of Toba is vast. We could go deeper still. We could explore specific archaeological sites in more detail. We could dive into the minutiae of genetic studies. We could examine climate models with greater precision. There's always more to learn, more to discover. The important thing is that we keep asking questions, keep seeking answers, keep learning from the past so we can prepare for the future. Because Toba isn't just history. It's prologue. It's a preview of what could happen again. And when it does, we need to be ready. Not just physically, but mentally, psychologically, culturally. We need to have the same resilience, the same adaptability, the same refusal to quit that the Toba survivors had. But we also need to have more knowledge, more technology, more cooperation, more wisdom. We have the advantage of knowing what happened before. The Toba survivors were walking blind. We don't have to. We can learn from their experience. We can prepare. We can do better. That's the promise we owe them, the descendants honoring the ancestors by being worthy of their sacrifice, by surviving whatever comes next and building a future that justifies all the struggle that came before. That's the final message of Toba, not just survival, but purpose, making the survival mean something, creating beauty and meaning and joy out of the darkness. That's what humans do. That's who we are, the children of catastrophe, the survivors, the builders, the dreamers. We carry Toba in our DNA. We carry it in our culture, we carry it in our souls, and we carry it forward into whatever future awaits, with courage, with hope, with the stubborn belief that no matter how dark it gets, we'll find a way through, because we always have, and we always will. That's the legacy of 74,000 years. That's the promise of the next 74,000. We are the survivors, and we will survive.